Hi guys. Tonight, we journey deep into the wild heart of the American frontier, where the mountains loom like silent giants and the winds howl through the trees. The air is biting, cold enough to freeze your breath into tiny clouds. Beneath a thick blanket of snow, the land is still, almost holding its breath. The silence is broken only by the occasional crack of wood as the frost tightens its grip. In these harsh, unforgiving surroundings, men once built their homes, simple yet sturdy cabins that would stand as a testament to human resilience. But to survive here wasn't easy. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin. The men who ventured into these wildernesses were known as mountain men. They weren't soldiers or settlers. They were hunters, trappers, and adventurers. They sought riches, but not in the traditional sense. Gold, fur, and the wild beauty of the land called to them. Yet, despite their courage and skills, they were not immune to the cruel winters that wrapped themselves around the mountains like a cold, suffocating embrace. Their story isn't just one of survival, it's about ingenuity, endurance, and the sheer will to carve out a place in a world that seemed determined to push them back. But how did they do it? How did these rugged men, armed with little more than axes and bare hands, create shelter in the wilderness to survive the brutal cold of the Rocky Mountains or the snow-cloaked peaks of the Appalachians? The answer is as much a part of history as the land they tamed. Building a cabin in the wild wasn't just about throwing up a roof and four walls. It was a battle with nature itself. Every decision from where to build, to what materials to use, and even how to keep the wind at bay was a matter of life or death. A misplaced log could lead to the death of a family, or worse, to the loneliness of an untimely demise. Imagine, for a moment, the men trekking into the deep wilderness, their faces chapped from the wind, their hands raw from the constant chopping. No roads, no neighbors, just them, the wilderness, and the cold. Finding a spot to build their home was often the first test. The terrain had to be just right, flat enough to build, but not so flat that it would flood in spring rains. The shelter had to be hidden enough to avoid prying eyes, whether from the Native American tribes or other fur trappers who might consider your territory their own. Many of these men were not just fighting nature, but the forces of other settlers and fur traders eager to claim their spot in the wild. Once the perfect spot was found, the men would begin their work in earnest. Timber was the first and often the only resource they could rely on. The first step in cabin construction was felled trees. Tall pines and sturdy oaks were the ideal materials. However, cutting down these trees was no easy task. Without modern saws or chainsaws, the mountain men had to rely on axes and handsaws, sometimes using nothing but sheer force. Can you imagine the sound of the axe biting into the wood, the thudding crash as a tree fell to the ground, and the smell of pine sap filling the air? It was a sound that rang with both victory and hardship. Each log that was felled had to be chopped into a suitable length, but the real trick wasn't just getting the logs into place. It was how to make them fit together tightly enough to keep out the cold. No one could afford gaps, as these could let in the bitter wind that could freeze a man in his sleep. To make the logs fit snugly together, the men used a process called notching. They would carefully cut notches at the ends of each log, allowing the logs to rest on each other like perfectly shaped puzzle pieces. If done correctly, this would make the cabin not only structurally sound but airtight. But that wasn't enough to withstand the mountain winters. The gaps between the logs needed to be filled with something. This was where the real ingenuity came into play. Native American tribes had long used materials like clay and moss to seal their shelters. Mountain men adopted these techniques, but they also got creative. Animal hair, mud, and even straw were pressed into the gaps between the logs, creating a surprisingly effective barrier against the wind and snow. The smell of wet earth and moss filled the air as these materials were packed into the spaces, sealing the cabin from the elements. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small hearth or fireplace served as the heart of the home. This was the place where the men cooked, heated their homes, and sometimes even slept. Building a fireplace in the wilderness wasn't easy. The chimney had to be constructed to allow the smoke to escape without choking the inhabitants inside. Without a proper fire, these men could not survive the freezing temperatures of the high mountains. The crackling of wood in the fire was one of the few sounds that could break the quiet solitude of the wilderness, and it became a comforting lullaby to the men as they settled in for the night. With the shelter built, the real test of survival began. Food was scarce in the winter months. Many mountain men relied on hunting and trapping to provide sustenance. You can almost hear the quiet rustle of animals moving through the snow, the faint snap of a trap as it closed on its prey, the quiet tension as the men waited, sometimes for days, to catch enough game to survive. But it wasn't just the animals they had to worry about. Cold was an ever-present enemy. There were no luxuries like insulated clothing, and it took all of a man's strength to keep warm enough to keep working. You could only pray that the fire would last long enough to keep you from freezing. Yet, despite the hardships, these men were unrelenting. They knew that the only way to survive was to keep pushing forward. They didn't just build homes, they created lives, forging a sense of community in a place that seemed determined to take everything from them. Every log, every stone, every ounce of effort was a victory. And when the cabin was complete, it wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress. As the fire flickers softly in the corner, the wind howls outside. But you are warm, safe, and protected. You have made it through the worst of it. For now. But the mountain men knew that survival wasn't just about building shelter, it was about building a life. And in that life, every struggle was a story worth telling. The wind howls outside, its eerie wail creeping through the cracks in the walls of the cabin. Inside, there's a soft crackling as the fire burns steadily in the hearth. But the warmth it offers is barely enough to push back the chill that seeps into the bones. You take a deep breath, the scent of pine and the earthy tang of moss filling your lungs. The cold can be suffocating out there, but here inside this cabin the mountain men were safe. For now. Imagine this, an entire winter spent in solitude, your only companions, the howling wind and the crackle of the fire. The only sounds were the scraping of tools, the cutting of logs, and the soft whisper of the snow as it drifted silently across the landscape. The men who built these cabins were living on the edge of the world, isolated in ways most of us would never experience. And yet, they persisted, because in the wilderness, you didn't have a choice. For these men, the first winter was always the most difficult. It was a trial by fire, a baptism into a harsh new world, where the slightest mistake could mean death. No longer could they rely on the comforts of civilization. There were no markets to trade in, no neighbors to call upon for help. The men learned quickly that their survival was entirely in their own hands. And their first task was clear: build shelter. The task wasn't as simple as stacking logs. Oh no, building a cabin in the wild was a calculated endeavor. It was about finding the right spot flat, but not too flat. A good location meant protection from the wind, enough timber nearby to build, and an environment where water could be accessed in the warmer months. But even if the perfect spot could be found, the harsh weather could make every step of the process feel like an uphill battle. One of the most important decisions was which trees to fell. Most mountain men relied on the types of trees that grew nearby, often pines, cedars, and oaks. Pine was especially valued because of its straight, long trunks, perfect for making logs. However, there was a downside to pine. Its sap was sticky, and sticky sap, when exposed to the cold, could make the logs harder to notch. Yet, these men knew that survival wasn't about comfort. It was about making do with whatever nature offered. The mountain men understood that the most important resource at their disposal was the land itself. The trees, the earth, the rocks, the animals all were potential materials for building a life. And they had to make it work. Every tool, every method had to be utilized with efficiency. There were no lumber yards, no hardware stores to visit. Everything came from the land, from the raw materials that nature had given them. This was a world where ingenuity and hard work made the difference between survival and failure. You could almost hear the sound of axe blades biting into the trees, the rhythmic thud as the logs fell to the ground. Each log was a piece of a puzzle, no two were the same. Each had its own unique shape and character. When it came to the actual construction of the cabin, every decision was critical. The walls had to be built strong enough to withstand the snow and the wind, but also stable enough to bear the weight of the roof. The cabin had to be small enough to heat efficiently, but large enough to keep a small family or group of men from feeling too claustrophobic. It was a delicate balance, one that required precision and skill. A slight miscalculation could lead to a structure that didn't hold up in the storm, or worse, one that let in the biting cold. The first thing the men would do was build a solid foundation. They couldn't afford to waste time with an unstable structure. Large stones or logs were laid out to form a base, leveling the foundation to prevent the cabin from sinking into the earth over time. You might imagine the sound of the men grunting and straining as they hefted the stones into place, each movement deliberate, each action measured. Everything had a purpose. Once the foundation was secure, it was time to begin the walls. The logs would be carefully notched to fit together. The process was time-consuming, requiring precision, and no logs could be wasted. The notches had to be just right, too shallow, and the logs wouldn't fit snugly together, leaving room for drafts and snow to enter. Too deep, and the logs would be weakened. The men had to carve each notch with care, sometimes using just an axe or handsaw. There's something almost meditative about the way the men worked, each movement slow, rhythmic, focused on the task at hand. In a world where survival was the ultimate goal, there was no room for rushing. Every action had to be deliberate. The chinking, or the filling of the gaps between the logs, was just as critical. Without proper chinking, the cold could seep in through the gaps, turning the cabin into an icebox. The men used anything they could find: clay, moss, even animal hair and mud. Imagine the sensation of packing these materials into the spaces between the logs, cold, damp clay against your hands, the smell of wet moss filling the air. The men worked tirelessly, covering every inch, ensuring that no draft could penetrate their shelter. And even though it was exhausting work, there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that the cabin was slowly taking shape. When the cabin was finally built, it was more than just a home. It was a fortress against the wild, a testament to the men's strength, perseverance, and resourcefulness. In this cabin, they would endure the coming winter, battling the cold and isolation, but knowing that they had created something that would keep them safe. The first winter would be their hardest test, but with the cabin standing strong against the elements, they would find that survival was possible, even in the most unforgiving of landscapes. The fire burns low now, the wind still howling outside. You close your eyes, imagining yourself in one of those cabins, the weight of the day's work behind you, the warmth of the fire spreading through your limbs. The wilderness is still and quiet. You've made it through another night. The fire crackles softly, filling the cabin with the comforting scent of burning wood. The storm outside is relentless, yet inside the shelter, you're safe. The wind howls and the snow falls in sheets, but here, inside these four log walls, there is warmth. The mountain men knew the struggle of the long winter months, where the cold could freeze your breath in the air and turn even the simplest of tasks into battles against nature itself. But they had learned how to survive in this world of ice and snow. And the first challenge was building a place to call home. Once that was done, the next step was keeping it warm. Building a cabin wasn't enough to ensure survival. That's a hard truth to face, but it's one the mountain men learned quickly. The next test of their endurance would be heating that cabin. In the wilds of the Rocky Mountains or the Appalachians, winter wasn't just cold, it was deadly. Without proper warmth, you wouldn't make it through the season. But warmth didn't come easily in a world that gave so little. Fire was the key, and the men knew that a proper fireplace could be the difference between life and death. The problem wasn't just creating a fire, it was managing it, making sure it lasted through the long nights and freezing days. A good fire needed fuel, and fuel meant chopping wood, a task that was never-ending, even after the cabin was built. The mountain men would spend hours gathering wood, splitting it into manageable pieces, then hauling it back to the cabin. Every day was an exercise in endurance. You could almost hear the rhythmic thud of axes striking wood, the faint scent of pine and oak filling the air. Each piece of firewood was precious. It wasn't just heat, it was the line between life and the brutal cold of the outside world. But firewood was just one part of the equation. Even if you had enough wood to last through the winter, keeping the cabin warm was an entirely different challenge. Most mountain cabins had a small stone or clay fireplace that would serve as both the kitchen and the heating source. But there was a catch. A small fire might warm the air directly around it, but the heat wouldn't be enough to fill the entire cabin. These fireplaces were designed to trap heat, but they couldn't work miracles. The men would often have to keep the fire burning all day long, stoking it with fresh logs whenever it began to die down. It was a constant battle, and at night they would close the doors and huddle near the warmth, making sure that the fire didn't go out in their sleep. As you sit there in front of the crackling fire, you can almost feel the warmth of the flames against your skin. The heat is a welcome comfort, but it's also fleeting. The fire isn't just a luxury, it's a matter of survival. The mountain men had to be careful with their fire, knowing that one misstep could lead to the cabin freezing in the night. If the fire went out, there was no way to start it again. The dampness of the cold would make the process of rekindling it nearly impossible. When the fire finally settled into a comfortable burn, the men could relax, but only for a while. They had to remain vigilant, checking the fire periodically throughout the night to ensure it didn't go out. As you lie in bed, the faint crackling of the fire is a lullaby of sorts, a reminder of how precarious your existence truly is. The wind outside may be howling, but in here you are protected, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in safety, even if only for a time. But the men knew that warmth wasn't the only thing they needed. They had to be prepared for every challenge the wilderness could throw at them. Building a shelter was only the first step. Once that was done, they had to survive. Food became a critical issue. In the harsh wilderness, supplies weren't readily available, and the mountain men couldn't rely on farming or foraging. They had to become experts in hunting and trapping, every day an exercise in patience and skill. The trees and animals around them weren't just part of the landscape, they were resources, and they had to be treated as such. Hunting was more than just a way to get food, it was a delicate dance between man and nature. The mountain men had to learn to read the signs of the land, to understand the movements of animals, to follow tracks in the snow, and to know when the time was right to strike. Every hunt had to be planned carefully. You couldn't afford to make mistakes. A missed shot or a wrong turn in the forest could mean starvation. The men had to use everything the land gave them, whether it was the flesh of a deer, the fur of a beaver, or the berries and roots they could forage in the warmer months. The sound of the forest was both a threat and a comfort. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant call of a coyote, the crunch of snow underfoot, all of these sounds meant that life was still happening outside, even as the mountain men fought to carve their own existence in this cold, unforgiving landscape. The wilderness was both a friend and an enemy, offering up its resources but also its dangers. The animals they hunted were not the only creatures that roamed these wild places. Bears, wolves, and even mountain lions were always a threat. You had to stay alert at all times, knowing that even when you were tucked into the warmth of your cabin, the wild was only ever a few steps away. But the men were resourceful, and they learned to turn everything to their advantage. They didn't just hunt, they trapped. They set up elaborate trap lines in the snow, creating snares and deadfalls to catch smaller game. The traps would be set, and then the men would wait. Patience was essential. You could hear the faint rustling of the wind, the soft crunch of snow beneath your boots as you made your way to the traps. Sometimes, after hours of waiting, you would find that the trap had been sprung. Other times, the wait would be for nothing. But the mountain men knew that persistence was key. They kept at it, day after day, always working toward that next meal, always preparing for the next winter. The cycle was endless. The men were constantly working, constantly preparing for the next season. But it was in these quiet moments, huddled near the fire with a meal in hand, that they could rest. They had built their cabin, they had survived the long winter, and they had endured. Life in the wilderness wasn't easy, but it was theirs, and they were living it on their own terms. And so, as the fire crackles low, you begin to drift off, the warmth of the hearth and the knowledge that you have survived another day easing you into sleep. Tomorrow, there will be more work to do. But for now, you're safe. For now, the wilderness is still. The morning light is soft as it filters through the thick window of your cabin. You stretch, the warmth of the fire still lulling your muscles to a slow ease. The snow is deep outside, and the world is still, broken only by the occasional drift of wind. There's no need to rush today. Survival is about patience. The cabin, now firmly standing against the landscape, is your fortress in the wilderness. But even as you sit there, the reality is clear. The battle never ends. The elements are always there, waiting for a mistake, a misstep that could turn your safe haven into a tomb. You've made it through the night, and now, the next task is maintaining the warmth of your shelter. Firewood is piling up by the door, but each piece will be carefully chopped and split. The wind outside howls in warning another storm is coming, and the snow may fall even heavier than before. Yet, inside the cabin, you feel that comforting sense of control. The walls, built with the labor of your hands, stand firm against the storm. You know that you are not merely surviving, you are thriving in a place where most would have failed. As you gather the tools for the day, your thoughts turn to what's next, chinking the gaps between the logs. This seemingly simple task is a critical one. The men who first built cabins in the wilderness knew that the smallest gap could let in cold drafts, enough to turn a warm home into an icy prison. The gaps between the logs weren't just imperfections, they were weaknesses. These spaces had to be sealed completely. The wind outside never slept, and the cold crept in through even the tiniest crack, chilling the bones. The first settlers were nothing if not resourceful. They took what they had at hand and used it with ingenuity. As the men worked, they found that nature had already given them the materials they needed. Clay, moss, mud, and even the hair of animals, everything was used to fill the gaps. The process was a delicate art. First, the logs were stacked. Then the material was carefully pressed into the gaps, working it into the crevices to seal them shut. Imagine the cool, damp sensation of pressing mud into a gap, the earthy smell filling the air as the chinking took shape. It was a simple process, but one that required patience and skill. No matter how tight the log walls were, without the right materials, the cold would creep in, threatening your very survival. The chinking, while necessary, was only the beginning. You knew that the stability of your shelter would be tested time and again. Nature could be kind, but it was more often cruel. The snow would pile up, sometimes blocking the entrance. The wind would howl, and the cabin would shake, groaning under the weight of the storm. You had to be prepared to face these challenges, just as the mountain men had been. They understood that to survive here, they needed to maintain their homes with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Every morning, once the fire was stoked, the men would inspect their shelter. They knew that the winter wasn't just a season, it was a challenge. The snow could bury a cabin, the ice could split the logs, and the constant pressure of the cold could cause the structure to weaken. But the men didn't just sit back and let nature take its course. They were constantly working, constantly tending to their shelter, and that work paid off. Outside, the wind grows colder, and the storm intensifies, but inside, the cabin remains a sanctuary. You know that it's not just the fire that keeps you warm. It's the labor, the dedication to maintaining this place, that ensures your survival. And yet, for all the work, you can't help but notice the isolation that comes with it. It's a loneliness that seeps into the bones, and though you're surrounded by your own handiwork, the silence of the wilderness can be deafening. The solitude isn't just physical, though the distance from others is clear, but emotional as well. In the wilderness, the mountain men lived in isolation, sometimes for months at a time. They rarely saw other souls, and when they did, it was often in fleeting moments, a passing encounter with another trapper or a distant neighbor. But the men knew that this isolation was part of the price for survival. To be so far removed from civilization was to be free, in a way. They weren't bound by the rules of the world that lay beyond the mountains. They were bound only to the land itself. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was real. For many, this was the ultimate expression of independence, living off the land, building a life from the wilderness. Every log cut, every trap set, every gap filled with mud and moss was a testament to their self-sufficiency. They weren't just existing, they were creating something from nothing, carving their mark into a world that seemed so unforgiving. As you sit there, looking out through the cabin's small window, you realize that you too are part of this world. You've braved the cold. You've built a shelter against the storm. You've faced nature's wrath and stood firm. In a way, you are connected to those who came before you, those rugged mountain men who faced this same landscape, battling the elements, day by day, to carve out their place in the wilderness. The storm outside may still rage, but inside your cabin, you are warm. The fire crackles softly, the light dancing on the walls, and the snow continues to fall. Yet here, in the comfort of your home, you are not just surviving, you are part of a long tradition of resilience and strength. The wind howls like a distant, mourning animal outside, its icy fingers reaching for the cracks in your cabin's walls. But inside, you're safe, wrapped in warmth from the fire that dances in the hearth. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, the only light in the darkened room, but the heat is a constant reminder of the world outside. Here, inside these log walls, you've built a life, one that stands defiant against the elements. Yet, as the snow continues to fall, the reality settles in. The survival of this cabin doesn't just depend on the warmth it holds, it also depends on how well you've stocked it. The mountain men, isolated from the rest of the world, lived in a constant cycle of self-reliance. There were no grocery stores to rely on, no farmers to barter with. If you wanted food, you had to make it happen yourself. The harshness of the wilderness meant that your provisions needed to last, and this meant mastering the art of preservation. Whether it was drying meat or storing root vegetables, every meal required forethought. But the true test was surviving the long months when fresh food wasn't an option. How did they do it? The process began long before the cold arrived. In the fall, the men would gather what they could: wild game, fresh vegetables, and fruits. They had to be resourceful, relying on everything the wilderness provided. The rivers were full of fish, and the forests teemed with animals like deer, rabbits, and squirrels. But hunting and trapping weren't just methods of gathering food, they were ways of preserving a sense of control in a world that offered little security. The animals didn't care about human needs. They only cared about surviving themselves. Once the game was caught, the real work began. Preservation was crucial. Drying, smoking, and salting were the most effective methods. There was an art to smoking meat, and the men of the wilderness knew it well. The scent of wood burning and the rich, savory aroma of meat drying in the smoke would have filled the air around the cabin. You could almost taste the smoky flavor as the meat cured. They would string up the meat in a sheltered spot, often using the cool, dry air of the mountain valleys to help with the process. As the days turned to weeks, the meat would slowly dry, becoming a portable, long-lasting food source. Yet it wasn't all about meat. The mountain men were also skilled at preserving other essentials, like fruits and vegetables. They would bury root vegetables like potatoes and carrots in cool, dry earth to keep them fresh through the winter. Herbs would be dried and stored for seasoning, and berries would be carefully preserved, often in jars, to be used in the colder months when fresh produce was scarce. You could almost hear the soft rustling of leaves as they harvested, the gentle crack of a dried herb being crushed between fingers, ready to be added to a warming stew. But what happened when the snow came and covered everything? What happened when the game became scarce and the supplies dwindled? The men were never truly alone in this battle for survival. The land itself became their ally and their greatest enemy. They could rely on their wits, their tools, and their ability to read the signs of nature. In winter, when hunting was more difficult, trapping became a critical skill. The mountain men set up elaborate trap lines, stretching across the forest floor, hoping for a successful catch. The traps would catch smaller game, like rabbits or squirrels, and occasionally larger animals, such as beavers or wild boars. The scent of wood, cold metal, and freshly laid traps would fill the crisp mountain air as they set them in strategic spots. You can imagine the delicate balance required setting traps in the right location, being mindful of the weather, and always preparing for the unexpected. But even with the traps, there was still the question of how to store the food once it was caught. The answer was often simple: keep it cold. In the mountains, the ground stayed frozen for much of the year, and this natural refrigeration became a crucial part of life. Carcasses would be dragged to a secluded spot, covered in snow to keep them fresh, and then retrieved once the chill of the outside air had preserved them enough for consumption. It wasn't just about food, though. Survival in the wilderness required a mastery of multiple skills. The cabin, though sturdy, couldn't survive on its own. There were always repairs to be made, loose shingles to be hammered in place, gaps in the walls to be sealed, and firewood to be chopped. Every day was a constant effort to maintain the life they had built, and with each passing day, the men grew more attuned to the rhythms of the land. They learned the best times to hunt, when to trap, and even how to predict changes in the weather. With each change of the seasons, they adjusted their strategies, becoming more and more resourceful. But all of that was only possible because of one thing: preparation. The men who built their cabins knew that if they didn't plan ahead, they wouldn't survive. Every task, every step in the process, had to be thought out. Every piece of wood, every log, every trap laid, every root vegetable harvested, it all had to come together to make it through the long, deadly winter. As the storm outside continues to rage, you're reminded of the mountain men's daily struggle. With the fire warming your bones, the food you've preserved hanging from the rafters, and the logs securely holding the roof above you, you've created a life here, a life that holds, for now, against the bitter forces of nature. The isolation, the cold, the storms, they all serve as a reminder that survival isn't just about brute strength, it's about resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to the world around you. The cabin that stands as your shelter isn't just a building, it's a symbol of endurance, a mark of your ability to endure what the wilderness throws at you. As the flames crackle softly, you close your eyes for a moment, feeling the heat of the fire against your skin, and for just a moment you are completely content. Tomorrow, there will be more work, but tonight, you are safe. The storm outside continues its furious rampage, but inside your cabin, a profound sense of peace has settled. The fire, now glowing low in the hearth, casts a warm amber light across the walls, flickering and dancing in the quiet of the night. The crackle of the fire fills the space, and for a moment, it's easy to forget the harsh world beyond your cabin's door. But as the wind howls and snow piles up, you know that survival here is never a given. It's the constant work, the daily rituals, and the willingness to adapt that keeps you alive in this relentless wilderness. Once the cabin was built and the fire kept burning, the next task of survival was truly beginning. The long winters in the mountains weren't just about staying warm, they were about staying fed. And food didn't come easily in the frozen world outside. The mountain men who had settled in this rugged landscape didn't have access to the luxury of plentiful crops or easy hunting. Instead, they relied on their knowledge, their traps, and their ability to hunt strategically. Each day, the work of food gathering became more and more vital. The men had learned long ago that surviving here meant being constantly vigilant, whether it was scouting the land for game, setting traps, or fishing in frozen rivers. The key to their success lay in their ability to utilize every resource at their disposal, whether it was the animals roaming the wild or the natural elements surrounding them. Hunting was the most obvious way to obtain food, and the mountain men had to be exceptional hunters. But hunting wasn't just about going out with a rifle. It was a game of patience, strategy, and skill. The men had to study the behavior of the animals, learning the signs of their movements, understanding the weather patterns, and using the terrain to their advantage. The mountains, though rich with wildlife, didn't give up their bounty easily. A missed shot, a wrong turn, or an ill-timed decision could leave a hunter with an empty stomach. There were no guarantees in hunting. The mountain men would sometimes go days without a successful kill, their stomachs rumbling in the cold, their hopes dashed by the harsh reality of the wilderness. They learned that hunger was as much a part of survival as warmth and shelter. And yet, despite the constant challenge, they knew that with each failure, they were getting closer to their goal. Every time they set out, they were learning more about the land, more about the creatures that called it home. But hunting wasn't the only method for gathering food. Trapping became just as important, if not more so. Traps were set in strategic locations, with the mountain men often working in the early hours before the light broke through the trees. The delicate sound of snow crunching underfoot, the subtle shift of the air, the feeling of the cold biting into your skin, it all added up to one goal: the successful capture of game. The traps were set, often in the form of snares, deadfalls, or pit traps, each designed to catch animals with minimal effort. It wasn't as glamorous as hunting with a rifle, but it was efficient, and it allowed for food to be caught while the men focused on other tasks, such as gathering firewood or working on repairs to the cabin. The moment of anticipation when a trap was checked was one of quiet hope, a momentary breath held as the men would discover whether or not their efforts had paid off. The mountain men understood that their lives depended on these quiet, daily tasks. When a trap was successful, it brought not only food but also a sense of relief, a brief moment of triumph in the ongoing struggle to survive. You can imagine the quiet joy that must have filled a man when he pulled a rabbit from a snare or found a beaver caught in his trap. It wasn't just food, it was proof that the strategy was working, that the world was still playing in your favor. And yet, not every day brought success. In the wilderness, there were always moments when the land seemed to turn against you. Snowstorms would bury the traps, or game would become elusive, slipping away just out of reach. The isolation was another constant challenge. In the rare moments when mountain men encountered others, it was often brief, two solitary souls passing each other on the mountain trail, sharing a quick nod before continuing their separate ways. They were connected, yet isolated by their shared solitude. But these men weren't just surviving, they were thriving in their own way. The wilderness may have been unforgiving, but it also offered freedom. With each successful hunt, with each piece of food preserved for the winter, the men were creating something more than just a means of survival. They were building a life forged from the challenges of nature and strengthened by their ability to adapt. Food wasn't the only thing the mountain men had to think about. The constant work of maintaining the cabin was just as essential. The structure they had built wasn't just a shelter, It was a fortress that had to withstand the changing seasons, the weight of the snow, and the relentless wind. The logs needed to be inspected regularly, gaps had to be sealed, and the roof had to be checked for leaks. As the firelight flickers softly, you imagine the life of those men. Each day was a battle with nature, a test of their will and resourcefulness. They didn't have modern conveniences, and yet they were able to endure. Every action they took, whether it was chopping wood, setting traps, or cooking a meal, was a deliberate choice to survive in this harsh environment. Every successful hunt, every day that they could feed themselves, was a small victory in the ongoing struggle for life. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also unforgiving. The weather could change in an instant. Snowstorms could trap you inside for days, and animals could be scarce. But despite these challenges, the mountain men didn't just survive, they adapted, learning the rhythms of the wilderness and finding ways to make it work. The log cabin they built wasn't just a shelter, it was a testament to their determination and ingenuity. As the wind howls once again outside, you feel a sense of connection to those who built their homes in this very wilderness. The same cold, the same isolation, the same struggle for survival, they all echo in the quiet moments by the fire. And in that stillness, there's a realization that you, too, have made it through another day, another challenge. The mountain men knew the importance of resilience. They understood that survival wasn't just about brute strength, it was about adapting to the world around you, using the land's resources wisely, and never giving up. As the storm rages on outside, you are reminded of that spirit of survival. The cold may press against the walls, but here, inside your cabin, you are warm. The cabin is quiet now, save for the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft, persistent howling of the wind outside. The storm continues its relentless march across the wilderness. But inside, the warmth of the hearth holds back the chill. You can't help but admire the resilience of the mountain men who lived in this very place before you. They knew that the key to survival lay not only in their physical strength, but in their ability to adapt, to use every resource the land gave them, and to remain vigilant in the face of relentless challenges. As the fire flickers, you're reminded that surviving in the wild isn't just about building a shelter, it's about maintaining that shelter in the face of the unforgiving elements. The mountain men who lived here weren't just builders, they were engineers, constantly repairing, improving, and fortifying their homes against the ravages of nature. Each log, each nail, each stroke of the axe was part of a larger effort to make sure their cabin could endure through the harshest winters. The roof, for example, was one of the most vulnerable parts of the cabin. Snow and ice would build up over time, pressing down with a weight that could collapse a poorly built shelter. The men knew that they had to keep a careful eye on the roof, especially after a heavy snowfall. A roof built with care, using thick beams and ensuring there were no weak points, could protect them from falling snow and ice. They would often climb onto the roof to inspect it, clearing off snow when necessary to prevent the weight from becoming a problem. Imagine the chill of the mountain air, the snow crunching beneath your boots as you climb up to the roof to ensure everything is still in place. You know that every piece of wood is a lifeline, a barrier between you and the harsh world outside. The mountain men also understood that the foundation of the cabin was just as crucial as the walls or the roof. Without a solid base, the entire structure could sink into the earth or become unstable over time. They used large stones or logs to create a foundation that would stand strong against the freeze-thaw cycles of the seasons. The sound of the men working, cutting, hammering, and placing stones must have been a familiar one, a steady rhythm that marked the passing of the days as they tirelessly worked to ensure their home remained intact. Beyond the physical structure, there was another challenge the mountain men faced: the psychological toll of living in isolation. Surviving in the wilderness was a test of endurance, not just for the body, but for the mind. The solitude could be overwhelming. Long months without seeing another soul, the constant struggle against the elements, the isolation was deafening at times, and the loneliness could be suffocating. But the men found ways to cope, and their resourcefulness extended beyond survival tools. They often kept journals, recording the details of their days, the animals they saw, the weather patterns, and their thoughts. These written records were a way of keeping the mind sharp, a way to stay connected to something beyond the cabin walls. Some men found comfort in their memories, holding on to stories of the lives they left behind in the cities or towns they once knew. Others found solace in the landscape itself, the rugged beauty of the mountains, the sound of a distant river, or the stillness of a winter forest, all became part of the rhythm of their days. In the absence of human company, the land became their companion, and nature's presence was a quiet but constant reminder of the life they had chosen. The resilience of the mountain men wasn't just about surviving winters, it was about finding ways to thrive in a place that, to many, would seem impossible to live. Their cabins were small but sturdy, and they were a direct reflection of the men who built them. Strong, resilient, and unyielding, the cabins were the heart of their existence. They were places where meals were cooked, fires were tended, and stories were shared, even if only with the wind and the trees. As the night deepens and the fire continues to burn low, you find yourself drifting into a reflective calm. You can feel the weight of the mountains pressing in, the cold that creeps against the walls, the constant reminder of the struggle to survive. But in this moment, inside this cabin, there is peace. The work is never done, but for tonight, you've made it. Tomorrow, the wind will howl again, the snow will fall, and the work will continue. But for now, you are safe, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the knowledge that you've survived yet another day in this wild, unforgiving land. The mountains, with their harsh beauty, will always be there, a reminder of the challenges you've faced and the strength you've shown. As the fire burns low and the wind howls, you feel a deep connection to those who came before you, the mountain men who built this cabin, who faced the same cold, the same isolation, and who, like you, found a way to make it through. For now, the storm rages outside, but inside, you are sheltered. Inside, you are warm. And tomorrow, you will continue to survive. The world outside the cabin is a white blur, snow swirling in the wind, the sound of it howling across the land like a living thing. The storm has been relentless for hours, and you know it will last through the night. But within the sturdy walls of your cabin, the storm becomes little more than a distant sound, a reminder of the power of the wilderness that surrounds you. Here, in the warmth of the fire's glow, you have found shelter, but you also know that the work never ends. The wilderness doesn't care that you're tired. It doesn't care if the storm has been raging for days. For survival, you must keep pushing forward. One of the greatest challenges the mountain men faced was the isolation. They built their cabins far from other settlements, in places where few dared to go. These locations, while providing the protection and solitude they sought, also kept them in constant isolation. There were no neighbors to call upon for help. There were no familiar faces to trade stories with over a hot meal. The only company the mountain men had was the wilderness itself. And, as much as it could offer beauty and solace, the wilderness was also unforgiving. In the midst of this isolation, the mountain men developed a profound sense of self-reliance. Their entire survival depended on their ability to fix things, build things, and make do with whatever they had at hand. When the cabin needed repairs, they didn't have the luxury of calling for help. If a log in the wall had loosened or the roof needed attention, it was their responsibility to fix it. Tools had to be kept sharp, and every corner of the cabin needed to be maintained. Each task, whether it was felling trees or preparing food, was done with an understanding that no one else was coming to help. When the first snowfalls came, it was a reminder that the months ahead would be long and difficult. The mountain men knew they needed to prepare for the worst. Hunting would become harder as the weather worsened, and the animals grew more scarce. The winter would test them in ways they hadn't yet imagined. But that first snowfall wasn't just a warning, it was a signal that it was time to act. The work of gathering, preparing, and preserving had to be done before the weather made it impossible to leave the safety of the cabin. By the time the snow was falling in earnest, the men had already gathered most of their supplies. Furs, meat, dried herbs, and vegetables were stored safely in the cabin, each item carefully arranged to make it through the winter months. Meat was hung from the rafters, salted and smoked to preserve it. Root vegetables were buried deep in the earth to keep them fresh. The men knew that in the wild, nothing could be left to chance. If they didn't plan, they wouldn't survive. The cabin itself, though a humble structure, became a symbol of the mountain man's ability to conquer nature. It was simple, but it was functional. The walls, made from hand-hewn logs, were sturdy enough to hold back the winter winds. The roof, though not as elegant as the ones found in cities, was constructed to bear the weight of the snow, and the hearth, the heart of the cabin, provided warmth, light, and the ability to cook food. The fire was the lifeblood of the cabin. Without it, the men would have been lost. And yet, as the storms raged on, the men were constantly aware of the fragility of their situation. The cabin might stand strong for now, but they had to remain vigilant. Snow could collapse a roof, and the ice could tear apart the foundation if it wasn't kept in check. Even with all the preparation, the mountain men knew that the wilderness was never truly predictable. It could give, and it could take away. The fire crackles in the hearth, and you find yourself lost in the warmth of the cabin. You think about the men who came before you, their lives carved from the same land, their struggles mirrored in the challenges you face now. They had to learn to listen to the wilderness, to understand its rhythms and its moods. They knew when to prepare, when to work, and when to rest. And as the storm continues its fury outside, you realize that you too have become part of that rhythm. The wilderness is no longer something you fight against. It is something you work with, adapt to, and respect. Outside, the snow piles up, and the wind pushes against the walls of the cabin. But inside, there is peace, there is warmth, and though the night is long and the storm is fierce, you know that you are safe. The mountain men were never truly safe. They knew that each day could bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but they persevered, carving their place into the wilderness, proving that survival was not just about living, it was about thriving, adapting, and enduring. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, there will be more work to do. The traps will need to be checked, the firewood replenished, and the cabin inspected. But for now, you rest. You've made it through the worst. And for tonight, that's enough. The cabin, though humble, is a fortress, a refuge from the storm. Inside, you are protected, you are warm, and you are a part of the history of those who came before you, those rugged mountain men who built these cabins and fought to survive in this wild, unforgiving land. The storm outside continues, but inside your cabin there is a steady warmth. The fire has been stoked and crackles merrily in the hearth, sending flickers of light across the room. The howling wind may batter at the walls, and snow may pile up against the door, but within these four walls, you are safe. The isolation that seemed so daunting when you first arrived now feels like a protective cloak. You've settled into the rhythm of this life, accepting the solitude, the quiet, and the ceaseless tasks that come with living in the wilderness. As the fire burns low, you take a moment to reflect on the life of the mountain men who once lived here. Their existence was one of constant adaptation and survival. Every day, they faced challenges, harsh weather, scarcity of resources, isolation, and yet they endured. Their strength wasn't just in their physical capabilities, it was in their unwavering determination to thrive in a place that most would call uninhabitable. They understood that survival wasn't just about enduring the elements, it was about making the wilderness work for them. The construction of their cabins was a critical part of this effort. These were not mere shelters, they were lifelines, carefully designed to withstand the brutal forces of nature. The men didn't simply build cabins for protection, they built homes that would allow them to live, to work, and to thrive in a world that gave little in return. The cabins were small but sturdy, made of logs carefully notched together, each piece perfectly placed to keep the cold out and the warmth in. The fire in the hearth wasn't just for light or comfort, it was the heart of their existence, providing warmth, heat for cooking, and a means to survive the long, cold winters. But even as they built their homes, the mountain men were acutely aware that their survival didn't depend on shelter alone. They had to be prepared for everything: hunting, trapping, food preservation, and maintaining their cabins were all part of the daily grind. The wilderness didn't care about their struggles, it didn't care if they were tired or cold or hungry. The wilderness simply was, and in it, the mountain men had to learn to survive, using everything the land offered. Food was a constant concern. With no grocery stores or markets to rely on, the mountain men had to depend on their own hunting and trapping skills to feed themselves. They had to be keen observers of the land, learning where to find game, how to track it, and when to hunt. Hunting wasn't just a way to get food, it was an intricate dance with nature, a test of patience, precision, and skill. The animals didn't give themselves up easily, and the men had to prove themselves worthy of the prize. Trapping was another essential skill. The men set elaborate trap lines throughout the forests, using snares, deadfalls, and other traps to catch smaller game like rabbits, squirrels, and even larger animals like beavers. The traps had to be placed just right, in the perfect location, to ensure success. If the trap was set too high or too low, or if it wasn't positioned just so, the game would slip away. It required constant attention and vigilance. And while setting traps was less glamorous than hunting with a rifle, it was incredibly effective. It allowed the men to continue their work, knowing that they had food even when they weren't actively hunting. Preserving food was just as important as gathering it. The mountain men had to make sure they had enough to last through the long winters when hunting and trapping were far less successful. Drying meat, smoking fish, and storing root vegetables were all vital to survival. Every day the men would prepare, preserve, and store food for the months ahead. The process wasn't quick or easy. It required patience and skill. The meat would be salted, smoked, or dried, and stored carefully so that it wouldn't spoil. The smell of smoked meat would linger in the cabin, a constant reminder of the hard work that had gone into preparing for the winter. But despite all their preparations, the mountain men knew that no amount of food or shelter could guarantee survival. Nature was always unpredictable. The weather could change in an instant. A sudden snowstorm could trap a man in his cabin for days, or a fierce predator could attack at the most inopportune moment. The mountain men understood that their lives were fragile, and that each day in the wilderness was a battle not just with the elements, but with their own endurance. The first winter was always the hardest. It was a test of every skill they had, a trial of their resolve. The cold would seep into every corner of the cabin, making even the smallest task feel monumental. The fire in the hearth had to be tended to constantly, the logs split, and the wood gathered. If the fire went out, there would be no way to start it again, not without risking frostbite and death. Every meal had to be carefully rationed, every bite precious. The men had to endure long stretches of isolation, with no one but the land itself to keep them company. Their only connection to the outside world came when they ventured into the nearby trading posts or when they crossed paths with other trappers. But those meetings were brief, and often the only thing exchanged was a few words and some supplies before they went their separate ways. Living in such isolation wasn't easy. The mountain men had no choice but to adapt. They had to develop a deep connection to the land, understanding its rhythms, its dangers, and its rewards. They couldn't afford to waste time. Every day was spent working towards survival, making sure that their cabin stood firm against the weather, that their food would last, and that they were prepared for whatever the wilderness threw at them. The fire crackles in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the cabin, and for a moment you feel the comfort of that same resilience. The mountain men who came before you knew how to make the most of what they had, how to survive against all odds, and how to find strength in the simplest of things: a well-built cabin, a carefully preserved meal, a steady fire to ward off the cold. Their legacy is written not just in the logs of their cabins, but in the spirit of survival they left behind, a spirit that endures in every corner of this wilderness. The storm outside rages on, its icy grip squeezing the world into a frozen landscape of white and grey. The howling winds whip through the trees, the sound of nature's fury pressing against the walls of your cabin. But here, inside, the warmth of the fire surrounds you, its flickering light dancing on the walls. The solitude is both peaceful and unnerving, a quiet that presses in on all sides. You are alone in this vast wilderness, and yet you are not truly alone. The cabin, the fire, and the land around you hold a presence, a reminder of those who once lived in this very space and survived through their own ingenuity and resilience. The mountain men who built these cabins didn't just create structures to shelter themselves from the cold, they built homes that embodied their ability to survive against the odds. Their cabins were their sanctuaries, their strongholds in a hostile world. But the work didn't stop once the cabin was finished. It was the beginning of a long, relentless battle against the elements. Building the cabin was only the first step. The real test lay in keeping it standing, keeping it functional, keeping it warm through the brutal months that lay ahead. Each winter, they faced a new challenge, and the men who built these homes knew that their survival depended on their ability to maintain them, to reinforce them against the oncoming storm. The roof was one of the most vulnerable parts of the cabin. Snow would build up on it, and if the roof wasn't strong enough, the weight of the snow could collapse it. The mountain men had to constantly maintain their roofs, especially during the heavy snows of winter. If the roof was too flat, the snow would gather and create a dangerous burden. The men often had to climb up onto the roof to remove the snow, a task that was as risky as it was essential. The cold wind would bite at their skin, and the icy surface of the roof would make it difficult to keep their balance. Yet, they had to do it because without a sturdy roof, they would lose everything. Beyond the roof, the walls required constant attention as well. The logs that made up the cabin's walls had to be checked regularly. The cold could cause them to shrink or warp, creating gaps that allowed the wind to sneak in. The mountain men knew that if the wind could get inside, it would slowly wear them down. The cabin wasn't just a place to sleep, it was the center of their world. The fire in the hearth kept them warm, but if the wind found its way through the gaps in the walls, the warmth would slip away as fast as it came. So, the men would spend hours sealing the gaps, stuffing moss, clay, or animal hair into the cracks to keep the cold at bay. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. The fire itself was another constant concern. It was the heart of the cabin, the thing that kept them alive. Without a fire, the cold would win. The men would chop wood in preparation, storing it near the cabin so they always had fuel. Every day, they would tend to the fire, keeping it stoked and burning bright. It was a simple task, but one that required constant attention. If the fire went out, there was no guarantee they could restart it without risking frostbite. The fire didn't just keep them warm, it was a lifeline. The smell of burning wood, the sound of the crackling flames, the flickering light, all of these became a constant presence in their lives, a reminder that as long as the fire burned, they had a chance. Outside, the storm rages on, but inside, the cabin is still. The work of the mountain men is reflected in the quiet of the cabin, every log, every gap sealed, every piece of wood carefully chopped and stacked. The fire burns low, its warmth still radiating through the room. The men who once lived here didn't just build to survive, they built with purpose, with a knowledge that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about adaptability, about using the resources at hand, and about finding solutions in the face of constant challenge. The mountain men understood that living in the wilderness was a delicate balance. It wasn't just about weathering the storms, it was about preparing for them, adapting to the changes of the seasons, and constantly working to maintain the life they had built. They lived in a world where every decision mattered. A single mistake could cost them everything. But in the quiet moments, when the wind howled outside and the fire flickered softly in the hearth, they found a sense of peace. The cabin was their home, and in the face of everything the wilderness threw at them, it was their fortress. But for all the challenges they faced, the mountain men also had a deep connection to the land around them. They weren't just surviving, they were living with the land, learning its rhythms and secrets. They knew when to hunt, when to gather, and when to rest. The seasons were their guide, and through it all, the mountain men became part of the landscape, a small but enduring part of a vast and unforgiving world. As the fire continues to burn low, you feel the weight of that same resilience. The mountain men built their homes from the earth, from the trees, and from their own sweat and effort. And in that effort, they found a kind of peace, a quiet satisfaction in knowing they had mastered the art of survival. Their legacy, written in the walls of these cabins, is one of endurance, strength, and an unwavering determination to live in harmony with the wild. Tonight, as you sit by the fire, you are not just in a cabin, you are in a testament to survival, to resilience, and to the indomitable spirit of the mountain men who once called this place home. And as the storm rages outside, you know that, for now, you are safe. The storm outside seems to stretch on forever, its ferocity never letting up, a constant roar of wind and snow battering the walls of your cabin. Yet inside, the crackling fire provides a warmth that contrasts with the harsh world beyond. As the cold presses against the walls, you can't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the structure that surrounds you. The cabin that protects you is a legacy of perseverance and ingenuity, crafted by hands that face the same fierce elements you now endure. The mountain men who once lived here were true survivors, learning to coexist with a land that was at once beautiful and deadly. For them, building a cabin was only the first step. Once that shelter was created, it became their lifeline. Every part of the structure, every log, every stone, every beam, had a purpose, not just for protection, but for survival. These cabins were designed to withstand the fierce winters, to provide shelter in a world where nature often seemed indifferent to human life. And it wasn't just about withstanding the elements. It was about making life in the wilderness sustainable, about creating a home from nothing but raw materials and sheer determination. The mountain men who built these cabins were craftsmen and survivalists. Every day in the wilderness was a test of their skill and resilience. The first winter they spent in their cabins was always the most difficult. They had no way of knowing exactly how the seasons would affect their homes, how the weight of the snow would press down on the roof, or how the wind would shift through the trees. They had to learn quickly, adapting as they went along. This constant challenge to their skills, their ability to problem solve, and their understanding of the land made them masters of survival. You imagine what it must have been like for them in those early days. The harsh winds cutting through the trees, the overwhelming silence of the snow-covered landscape, and the unrelenting struggle to keep the fire burning. The fire wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. Without it, the cold would overtake them. But even more than that, the fire was a symbol of hope. It represented the effort, the willpower, and the determination required to survive in such an unforgiving environment. And, much like the mountain men themselves, it had to be tended to constantly, its flames carefully maintained, never allowed to flicker out. When they first set out to build their cabins, the mountain men had no blueprint, no plans. They relied on their knowledge of the land, their understanding of how to manipulate the materials around them. The logs they used for the walls came from trees that were felled by their own hands, and the stones for the foundation were gathered from the surrounding landscape. Every piece had to be chosen with care, and every log had to be placed with precision. There was no room for mistakes. Each piece of the cabin had to fit perfectly to ensure that the shelter would stand strong through the harshest storms. Once the basic structure of the cabin was complete, the next step was to make it livable. The walls had to be sealed, the cracks filled, and the roof reinforced. Every gap between the logs was carefully chinked with mud, moss, or even animal hair to prevent the wind from creeping in. Every surface was checked, every crack filled, and every corner reinforced. The mountain men were perfectionists, knowing that even the smallest mistake could lead to disaster. They knew the value of a well-built cabin not just as a shelter, but as a place where they could survive the long winters. A poorly built cabin could be the difference between life and death. Even after the cabin was built, the work didn't stop. The mountain men had to maintain their shelter constantly. The roof had to be checked after every snowfall. The firewood had to be chopped and stacked, and the walls had to be inspected for any damage. There was always something to be done, a new challenge to face, a new problem to solve. And while the mountain men might have worked alone most of the time, there was a deep sense of satisfaction in the knowledge that they had built something that would protect them. Their cabins weren't just structures, they were symbols of their resilience, their ability to adapt to the world around them, and their refusal to be beaten by nature. In many ways, the cabins were a reflection of the mountain men themselves. Simple, sturdy, and unyielding, these structures stood as testaments to their ability to survive in a world that offered little comfort. The fire that burned within them wasn't just a source of heat, it was a constant reminder of the work, the effort, and the determination that had gone into building their homes. The cabins provided warmth, shelter, and safety, but they also provided a sense of pride. These men had created something from nothing, something that would stand through the seasons, through the storms, and through the years. They had built homes where there was once only wilderness. As the storm continues outside, you feel that same sense of connection to the men who once lived here. Their cabins, though simple, were built with purpose and care. Every piece of wood, every stone, every beam was placed with the intention of creating a home, a place to survive, to rest, to find warmth in the midst of the cold. And as the wind howls and the snow piles up, you realize that the legacy of these mountain men lives on in the very shelter you now occupy. The fire crackles in the hearth, the warmth wrapping around you like a comforting embrace, and you know that, for now, you are safe. Tomorrow, the work will continue. There will be more to do, more firewood to chop, more repairs to make, more challenges to face. But for tonight, you rest. The cabin stands strong, the fire burns steady, and the storm outside rages on. But inside, you are sheltered, you are warm, and you are part of the unbroken chain of survival that stretches back to the mountain men who first built these homes in the wilderness. The night stretches on, but the warmth inside your cabin remains a steadfast companion against the howling wind and the bitter cold outside. The fire, though now dimming, continues to flicker with life, sending shadows dancing across the logs that make up the walls of your home. Outside, the snow has piled high, burying the world in a thick blanket of white. It's easy to imagine what it must have been like for the mountain men who lived here before you, men who, like you, were forced to endure the long, harsh winters, constantly battling the elements with nothing but their skills and their will to survive. For the men who first built these cabins, survival was never just a matter of brute force. It was about creating a life in a place that seemed determined to take everything from them. The wilderness didn't offer kindness. It didn't provide shelter, food, or warmth. It was a place where every day was a struggle, where every decision, whether it was about hunting, trapping, or maintaining the cabin, could mean the difference between life and death. These men, isolated in the deep forests and towering mountains, learned quickly that they had to rely on their ingenuity and adaptability. The cabins they built were as much about self-sufficiency as they were about protection. They weren't just places to sleep, they were homes in every sense of the word. These men crafted their shelters with a deep understanding of the land, using materials that they gathered with their own hands. The walls, made from logs felled by axes, the roofs reinforced with stones and mud, were not just constructed for the sake of shelter, they were constructed to withstand the worst the wilderness could throw at them. The fire, the hearth, the very air inside the cabin, they all played a role in ensuring that life could continue, even in such an unforgiving place. The first winter in these cabins was always the hardest. It was the moment when the reality of living in the wilderness truly set in. The cold would press in on every side, seeping through cracks in the walls and roof, turning the cabin into a cold shell unless the fire was tended to constantly. The work of gathering firewood never stopped. The men who built these cabins knew that without a steady supply of fuel for the fire, they would be lost. So, they chopped and stacked wood, filling every nook and cranny of the cabin with logs that would burn through the long nights. But firewood wasn't the only thing that needed attention. The mountain men who lived here also had to ensure that their food would last. The fall months were spent gathering meat, drying it, smoking it, and preserving it in any way possible to ensure it would last through the harsh winter. They didn't have the luxury of fresh supplies from a market. The food they stored was all they had, and they had to be strategic in making sure it was enough to carry them through the months when hunting became a difficult task, and when the cold made it almost impossible to forage for fresh berries or roots. The men were masters of preservation, using techniques like salting, smoking, and drying to ensure that they had food to eat long after the last deer had been hunted. And yet, for all the preparation, survival was never guaranteed. The mountain men knew that they could do everything right, build the strongest cabin, gather the most firewood, preserve the best food, and still face the harshest of challenges. A roof could collapse under the weight of snow, a trap might be set incorrectly, and the weather could change in an instant. In the wilderness, there was no such thing as certainty. The men were always working, always thinking ahead, always prepared for whatever might come next. They understood that survival was a series of small victories, each one necessary to make it through the next day. But it wasn't just about physical endurance. The isolation, the loneliness of being so far from civilization was perhaps one of the greatest tests. The mountain men often spent months at a time without seeing another soul. The silence of the wilderness could be deafening. In a world where companionship was scarce, the cabin became both a sanctuary and a prison. The men often turned to their journals, writing down the events of their day, the successes and failures, the observations of the animals, the weather, and the land itself. It was their way of keeping connected, of making sense of the solitude, and finding meaning in a life lived so far removed from everything they had once known. The work never ceased. The men would wake before dawn and work until nightfall. They would hunt, chop wood, maintain their cabins, and prepare for whatever the wilderness threw at them next. It was a life of constant vigilance, where every task had to be completed, every mistake fixed, and every resource carefully managed. The cabins weren't just homes, they were the foundation of their survival. The men didn't just build cabins, they built lives in a world that didn't offer them much in return. The storm outside continues, but inside, you find a kind of peace. You are safe here, in this cabin built from the sweat and determination of those who came before you. The work that once seemed endless, overwhelming, is now second nature. You've come to understand the rhythms of life in the wilderness, the daily tasks that keep you alive, the careful balance between effort and rest, and the resilience required to keep going when the world seems intent on making survival impossible. As you sit in the warmth of the firelight, you realize that this cabin, this life, is more than just a shelter. It is a testament to the strength and willpower of those who built it, and now you are part of that legacy. The storm rages outside, but inside, you are warm. The fire continues to burn, and the cabin stands strong, a symbol of survival, strength, and resilience. Tomorrow, you'll continue the work, as those before you did. For tonight, though, you rest. You are part of something larger than yourself, something timeless. The storm's fury shows no sign of letting up, but within the walls of your cabin, the world feels far more contained, far more manageable. Outside, the wind howls and the snow piles high, but inside, you are safe, protected by the labor of those who came before you. The fire crackles gently, its warmth spreading out to every corner of the room, a reminder of the quiet resilience of the mountain men who built this shelter. You can't help but wonder what it must have been like for them during their first winter in this harsh, untamed land. The cold, the isolation, the unrelenting work, they endured it all with the quiet strength that defined their existence. As the storm rages on outside, you reflect on the complexity of their survival. It wasn't just about surviving the storms or enduring the long winters. It was about creating a space, this very cabin, where they could endure, thrive, and even find a sense of peace amid the chaos. Every inch of this cabin tells the story of their persistence, their ability to turn the wilderness into a place where they could carve out a life. One of the greatest challenges the mountain men faced was finding enough food to last through the brutal winters. Once the snow began to fall and the cold took hold of the land, hunting became much more difficult. Animals, especially larger game like deer, were harder to find, and many of the smaller creatures, like rabbits and squirrels, hibernated or became scarce. The men had to adapt, using every skill they had learned over the years to ensure they wouldn't go hungry. They set up intricate trap lines across the land, carefully placing snares and deadfalls to catch small game. Trapping was as much about patience as it was about skill, waiting for the trap to catch something, checking the lines every day, and ensuring the traps were functioning correctly. The men also relied on their knowledge of the land to provide them with food. They knew where to find edible plants, even in the dead of winter, and how to use the meat of smaller animals like beavers or birds to make do when bigger prey was elusive. The sound of snow crunching underfoot, the quiet tension of checking traps, the anticipation of finding a catch, each of these moments formed the rhythm of their survival. They knew the land intimately, understanding its cycles and its moods. And with each successful catch, they reaffirmed their connection to the land and their ability to survive on it. But even the most well-laid plans didn't guarantee success. The weather could change unexpectedly, a trap could be sprung incorrectly, and an animal could slip past unnoticed. The mountain men were always prepared for the worst. They knew the importance of preserving food, smoking, drying, and salting it to make sure they had enough to last through the lean months. It wasn't just about preparing for today, but preparing for tomorrow, for the months when hunting would be near impossible. The smell of drying meat, the careful arrangement of food supplies, these became second nature, as vital as the fire itself. As the fire crackles softly, the wind continues to howl outside, a reminder of how relentless the wilderness can be. But within the cabin, you are sheltered. The storm may rage, but you are safe, surrounded by the legacy of those who survived before you. Their cabins were more than just homes, they were symbols of determination, ingenuity, and the relentless will to survive. Each log placed, each stone laid, was a statement of their ability to endure, to thrive in a place that gave so little. Their resilience lives on in the very walls around you. And yet, as you sit by the fire, a sense of quiet unease settles in. You realize that survival isn't just about building a cabin, setting traps, or maintaining a fire. It's about perseverance, the quiet, unspoken determination to keep going when the world around you seems to conspire against you. The mountain men had no guarantees. They lived in a world where each day could bring new challenges, new threats. But they kept going. They didn't just survive, they lived. They made their mark on the land, and their cabins, still standing strong after all these years, are a testament to that legacy. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, you'll check the traps, gather firewood, and tend to the cabin. The work never stops. But for tonight, the fire will keep burning, the storm will continue its assault, and you will rest. The cabin, your home, stands strong, the walls sturdy, and the fire crackling away, keeping the cold at bay. The night may be long, but inside these walls, you are safe. In the quiet moments, you feel connected to the mountain men who built this place. They too faced the storm. They too faced the cold, the isolation, and the endless work of survival. And they prevailed. The fire, the logs, the cabin, it all represents their strength, their resilience, and their ability to create life from the wilderness. As the wind howls and the snow falls, you know that you are part of that same legacy. You are safe here, in this cabin, because of the effort and strength that came before you. You are not alone. The night stretches on, the storm's fury relentless outside. The wind shrieks against the cabin, and the snow continues to fall in thick, heavy flakes, covering the world in a blanket of cold and white. But inside, there is peace. The fire, now burning low, crackles and pops, filling the room with the comforting scent of pine. The warmth radiates through the cabin, the embers glowing softly in the hearth. Here, you are sheltered, protected from the unyielding storm that rages outside. For the mountain men who lived here before you, this shelter, this cabin, was everything. It wasn't just a house, it was their fortress. It was the place where they could sleep safely, eat, work, and survive. But survival in this land didn't come easily. The wilderness was unforgiving, and every day presented new challenges. It wasn't enough to simply build a cabin and hope for the best. The mountain men had to continually maintain their homes, making sure that the walls stayed strong, the fire kept burning, and their supplies lasted until the next season. And this was just the beginning. It was the work outside, in the harsh world, that truly tested their resolve. The mountain men were masters of adaptation. They learned quickly that to survive in the wilderness, they had to constantly adjust to the changing conditions. Hunting, trapping, and foraging weren't just skills, they were ways of life. Every decision, every move they made, had to be calculated with the knowledge that failure could mean death. The land they inhabited was full of dangers, dangerous animals, unpredictable weather, and the ever-present threat of starvation. But the men didn't just face these challenges, they embraced them. They learned the rhythms of the land, the behavior of the animals, and the signs of the seasons. They became part of the landscape, moving with it, adapting to its moods and its rhythms. Hunting, of course, was one of the most crucial skills. In the beginning, it was the only way to feed themselves. The men didn't have the luxury of farms or stocked pantries. They had to be resourceful, learning to track animals, set traps, and use every part of the kill. The hunt wasn't just about getting food, it was about ensuring that they had enough to survive until the next hunt. A missed shot or a failed trap could leave them hungry for days, so every hunt had to be planned meticulously. The men knew that the animals of the land were just as determined to survive as they were, and so hunting became a delicate balance of patience, skill, and timing. But even with all their knowledge and skill, hunting was never a guarantee. The mountain men often spent days tracking game, sometimes coming back empty-handed. In those moments, it was the work of preserving food that proved to be just as important. The men learned how to dry meat, smoke fish, and preserve root vegetables. Preservation wasn't just about having something to eat. It was about ensuring that they could survive through the months when hunting would become nearly impossible. The long, cold winters could last for months, and the work they did in the fall to prepare would determine whether they made it through. If they didn't have enough to eat, if their food stores were inadequate, their lives would be in jeopardy. The preservation of food was an art, and it wasn't easy. Meat had to be carefully salted and smoked, vegetables had to be stored in the ground, and fish had to be dried in the wind. The cabin itself became part of the process. Meat was hung from the rafters, Jars of preserved berries and fruits were tucked away in corners, and every shelf and nook in the cabin became part of the larger effort to prepare for the worst. The smell of drying meat, of salted fish and herbs, filled the cabin during these months, and it became a comforting reminder of the effort it took to survive. When you sit here now, in this cabin, the fire crackling and the storm howling outside, you feel a deep connection to those who lived here before you. Their daily lives were filled with the constant work of survival, hunting, preserving, maintaining the cabin, and staying warm. They didn't have the luxury of convenience. Everything they needed to survive had to be earned. And though they were isolated in the wilderness, though they faced hardships that would break most people, they carried on. Their resilience was a quiet, steady force, and it's that same resilience that lived on in the cabin you now call home. In the silence of the cabin, with only the fire and the storm outside as company, you begin to appreciate the true weight of what the mountain men endured. They lived lives that were constantly tested by the elements, and they met each challenge with strength, ingenuity, and perseverance. They adapted to a world that was, at times, indifferent to their struggles, and they did so without complaint. They understood that survival wasn't a matter of brute strength alone, it was about knowing the land, reading the signs, and being prepared for whatever might come. The fire burns lower now, its warmth still lingering in the air, but the storm continues to rage outside, a reminder of the world beyond the safety of your cabin. You have come to understand the truth of this place, that survival in the wilderness isn't just about building a cabin or gathering food. It's about persistence, resilience, and the quiet determination to thrive in a place that constantly tests your limits. As the night stretches on, the storm outside doesn't seem so daunting anymore. You are here, in this cabin, surrounded by the legacy of those who came before you. The work continues, the challenges persist, but for tonight, you are safe. Tomorrow, there will be more to do, more wood to chop, more food to gather, and more tasks to maintain this small but sturdy cabin. But for now, you rest. You rest because you know that the legacy of survival that runs through the walls of this cabin lives on in you. The storm outside seems to have settled, though the wind still whispers through the cracks in the walls, reminding you that the wilderness is never truly at rest. But inside your cabin, there is a stillness, a quiet that wraps around you like the warmth of the fire. The snow outside has buried the world in white, turning the trees into skeletal sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, and the landscape into a stark, unforgiving expanse. But here, in the warmth of your cabin, you are sheltered from the storm. The mountain men who built these cabins knew what it took to endure this isolation, to create a home from the raw materials of the land, a place to rest, a place to fight off the cold and the loneliness. Each day in the wilderness was a constant negotiation with nature. The land provided, but only if you knew how to work with it. The men who first built this cabin understood that survival wasn't just about enduring the storms, the cold, or the hunger. It was about living with the land, using what it offered, and learning to bend with the winds, not break under them. They didn't build their homes to withstand only the seasons, they built them to survive the constant changes of the wilderness. There were no shortcuts in the mountains, no fast way to ensure survival. Every task, from gathering firewood to maintaining the cabin to setting traps, required time, patience, and skill. The men knew that they could not afford to waste time. If they did, the consequences could be dire. A cabin that wasn't properly maintained could collapse under the weight of the snow. Food that wasn't properly preserved could spoil and leave them hungry. The wilderness didn't offer second chances. Every decision was a matter of life and death. But it wasn't just the physical labor that made survival so difficult. The isolation, the loneliness of being so far from civilization, was one of the toughest battles the mountain men had to fight. They spent months without seeing another soul, sometimes going for years without the companionship of a fellow human being. The silence of the wilderness could be deafening. The days would pass slowly, the work relentless, the cold biting at their bones. But the mountain men knew that to survive, They had to stay strong, both physically and mentally. They couldn't afford to let the isolation wear them down. In these moments of solitude, the cabin itself became more than just a shelter. It became a lifeline. The walls of the cabin, the fire in the hearth, the tools they used, it was all part of their survival. The men relied on the cabin for more than warmth or safety. They relied on it for comfort, for a sense of stability in a world that was constantly changing. The cabin became a symbol of their ability to endure, their ability to carve out a space in the world that was entirely their own. As you sit by the fire, the crackling of the wood and the soft glow of the embers fill the room. You can hear the storm outside, but inside, there is peace. The work of the day is done, and you've survived another night. The mountain men who built these cabins did the same thing, day after day, year after year. They kept going, even when the weather seemed unbearable, even when the work felt endless. They understood that survival wasn't just about battling nature, it was about working with it, understanding its rhythms, and adapting to its challenges. But the mountains were never fully tamed. The men knew that the wilderness was always there, lurking just outside the door, ready to reclaim everything they had built. And yet, it was in that constant struggle against the elements, against the isolation, against the loneliness that they found meaning. It was in the small victories, the fire that burned all night, the trap that caught a meal, the cabin that stood strong against the storm, that they found purpose. The wilderness didn't make survival easy, but it gave the mountain men the opportunity to prove their strength, to prove their resilience, and to prove that they could carve out a life in a place that seemed intent on rejecting them. The fire in the hearth crackles louder, the last of the wood burning away into glowing embers. You can feel the warmth of the fire seep into your bones. A comfort in the otherwise cold stillness of the cabin. You think back to those early days, to the first men who settled here, and you understand something vital. Survival is not just about what you have, it's about what you do with what you're given. These men didn't have much. They had the land, they had their wits, and they had the tools they could make with their own hands. And that was enough. Outside, the wind continues to howl, but inside, you are safe. The cabin stands strong against the storm, a testament to the perseverance and resilience of those who came before you. The work will continue tomorrow. There's always more to do. The firewood must be chopped, the traps checked, the cabin maintained. But for tonight, you rest. The quiet of the storm outside contrasts with the steady warmth inside, and you feel the deep satisfaction of knowing that, for now, you've made it. You are part of the same legacy that these mountain men left behind, a legacy of strength, survival, and the will to endure. Tomorrow the storm will have passed, and you'll venture back out into the wilderness. But tonight, you are safe. Tonight, you rest. The storm has finally begun to ease, the howling wind now only a faint whisper as it drifts through the trees. The world outside has been transformed. What was once a chaotic swirl of snow and ice is now a quiet, frozen landscape, still and serene. The cabin, though, stands strong. The work of the past days and weeks, felling trees, chopping wood, sealing gaps in the walls, has paid off. You are safe here, nestled in the warmth and comfort of a place built by hands that were determined to survive, to endure, and to thrive in the wilderness. As you sit by the fire, watching the last embers burn out, you think about the mountain men who built this cabin. For them, the act of creating a shelter wasn't just about finding a place to stay, it was a way to assert control over the land. The wilderness may have been harsh and unyielding, but they carved a space for themselves in it. The cabin wasn't just a refuge, it was a statement of their resilience, their ability to adapt, and their deep connection to the land they called home. But building the cabin was just the beginning. The true challenge lay in maintaining it, and more importantly, maintaining their place in the wilderness. The world outside the cabin was unpredictable, always shifting with the weather, the seasons, and the demands of the land itself. And the men who built these homes knew that the real test of survival wasn't just in the construction of the shelter, it was in the constant vigilance required to keep it standing, to keep it functional, and to keep themselves alive. One of the most vital aspects of maintaining a cabin in the wilderness was managing the fire. The fire wasn't just for warmth, it was the heart of the cabin. It provided heat, light, and a way to cook food. The mountain men understood that without a fire, survival was impossible. The cold in the mountains could freeze a man in hours, and without fire, the cabin would be nothing more than a cold, empty shell. The fire had to be tended to constantly, day and night. There were no rest days when it came to the fire. Each log added to the hearth was a lifeline, ensuring that the men could keep the cold at bay, if only for a little longer. The challenge, however, wasn't just in keeping the fire burning, it was in the fuel. The men had to gather wood constantly, chopping and stacking it to ensure they had enough to last through the long winters. They worked tirelessly, knowing that each log they split and stacked would mean another night of warmth, another day of survival. The work of chopping wood never stopped. The men would wake before the sun rose, heading out into the cold to find more fallen trees, to cut the wood and haul it back to the cabin. They knew that the effort was never ending, but it was the price they had to pay to stay alive. But even with all the wood they could gather, the fire alone wasn't enough to ensure survival. They had to be resourceful in every way. Every part of the animal they hunted was used: its meat for food, its fur for warmth, and its bones for tools. The mountain men knew how to turn every resource into something useful. The wilderness did give freely, it only gave what was earned, and the men earned it with every hour of sweat, every moment of toil. The work was never easy, but it was necessary. Each task, whether it was hunting, foraging, building, or maintaining the cabin, was a piece of the larger puzzle of survival. The food they gathered, whether it was from hunting, trapping, or foraging, had to be carefully preserved. The mountain men didn't have the luxury of fresh food year-round. They had to learn how to dry, smoke, salt, and store food in ways that would last until the next hunting season. The smell of dried meat, of herbs curing in the cold air, became as familiar as the scent of the wood burning in the fire. Preserving food was as much about survival as the actual hunting or gathering. It was a necessary skill that allowed them to outlast the lean months of winter when food became scarce. You imagine the rhythm of their lives, the slow, steady work that went into every part of their existence. The way they would wake with the first light of dawn, tend to the fire, check the traps, and begin the day's work. Each action had a purpose. There were no wasted hours, no idle time. Every task was part of the larger effort to survive, to ensure that the cabin remained a safe haven amidst the wilderness. The work was hard, the isolation heavy, but the mountain men had found a way to endure. They had created something of their own in a world that didn't offer much, and in that they found peace. As you sit in the quiet of your own cabin, the fire now reduced to a soft glow, you feel that same connection to the men who came before you. The solitude may be overwhelming at times, but it's also a kind of peace. You have carved out a place in the world, just as they did. You have built your own shelter, tended your fire, and prepared for the challenges ahead. The wilderness is still wild, still unpredictable, but inside these walls, you are safe. Tomorrow, the work will continue. The tasks never stop, the weather never remains predictable, and survival requires constant vigilance. But tonight, as the last embers of the fire fade away, you know you've done your part. The storm outside has passed, and tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tasks to complete. But for now, you are at peace. The cabin, your refuge, stands strong. You have endured. You are part of the legacy of those who built this home, and their resilience lives on in you. The morning breaks quietly, the storm's fury having finally subsided, leaving behind a peaceful landscape blanketed in white. The sun, though weak, peeks through the thick cloud cover, casting a soft, pale light over the snow-covered ground. The world outside is still and silent, as if it too is taking a breath after the storm. But inside your cabin, The day begins with the steady rhythm of work. The fire has burned low overnight, and the warmth it provided has slowly faded. It's time to stoke it back to life, to start the day's tasks that will carry you through the next stretch of the harsh winter. As you rise from the warmth of your bed, you glance around the cabin, the sturdy walls, the fireplace that's always in need of attention, the shelves lined with preserved food, all these small, vital parts of your home remind you that survival here is an ongoing effort. The men who lived in this cabin before you knew this truth well. They weren't just focused on the construction of the shelter. They understood that keeping the cabin intact, maintaining their supplies, and ensuring the fire never went out were all equally important to their survival. The first task was always the fire. Without it, the cold would invade every corner of the cabin. The fire was a constant companion, a warm presence in an otherwise unforgiving world. The mountain men knew how to start a fire from scratch, and in the early days, they were often forced to rely on whatever materials they could find to keep it going. The first spark, the first crackling of kindling, was a small victory, a reminder that no matter how cold or isolated the world outside, inside the cabin, warmth could still be found. The fire wasn't just a means to stay warm, it was a lifeline. It allowed the men to cook, to dry meat, to keep away the chill of the long, dark nights. It was the heart of the cabin. Once the fire was going again, it was time to tend to the rest of the cabin. The men knew that maintaining their shelter was just as important as keeping the fire burning. The roof had to be inspected after every snowfall. If too much snow accumulated, the weight could cause it to collapse. The walls, too, required attention. Gaps between the logs had to be filled with moss, clay, or animal hair to keep the wind out. Even the smallest draft could turn the cabin into an icy tomb. The mountain men were constantly at work, inspecting, sealing, and ensuring that every part of the cabin was up to the challenge of the next storm. They had no choice but to stay vigilant. Outside, the world was still frozen, covered in snow. The air was crisp and cold, but there was something peaceful about it. The men who lived here before you knew that the landscape could be both beautiful and harsh, a place of solitude and isolation, but also of incredible freedom. The mountains were unforgiving, but they also offered something that the men cherished: independence. There were no rules out here, no one to tell them what to do. The land was theirs to work with, to shape as they saw fit. It was a harsh, difficult existence, but in that difficulty, there was a kind of freedom that couldn't be found anywhere else. The day ahead would be filled with the same tasks as always: gathering firewood, checking the traps, ensuring that the cabin remained secure. But even as you carry out these tasks, you know that there's something more beneath it all. It's not just about surviving the day or the winter. It's about proving that you can thrive in a place that seems designed to break you. The mountain men who built these cabins weren't just trying to stay alive, they were building lives in the wilderness. They were making something out of nothing, carving a space for themselves in a world that gave nothing freely. And, in the process, they created something that would outlast them. As you move through the familiar motions of the day, chopping wood, checking the traps, you can't help but think about the men who built this place. They had no maps, no guides, no roads to follow. They had only their instincts, their knowledge of the land, and their ability to create something from what the wilderness offered. Every log they cut, every trap they set, every gap they filled, these were the marks of their survival. The cabin they built wasn't just a shelter, it was a symbol of their resilience, their ingenuity, and their ability to turn a harsh, unforgiving world into a place they could call home. In many ways, their story is your story. The tasks you carry out today, the work that fills your day, is the same work that kept them alive. You, too, are part of this legacy. You're living in a place that has been built by hands that understood what it meant to survive, to adapt, and to make something out of nothing. The cabin is a testament to that. It stands as a reminder that, no matter how difficult the world may be, You can carve out your place in it, find shelter, and make it your own. As the day stretches on and the storm outside finally dies down, you feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. The fire is crackling again, the cabin is secure, and the world outside is still and peaceful. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tasks to keep the cabin standing. But for now, you have done enough. The work continues, as it always does. But tonight, you rest, knowing that you are part of a long legacy of survival and resilience. The mountain men who built these cabins before you didn't just survive the wilderness, they conquered it, turning it into a place where they could thrive. And now, in this cabin, you too are a part of that victory. The quiet of the post-storm world outside the cabin is a welcome change from the howling winds and swirling snow of the previous days. As the sun rises higher in the sky, its pale light dances off the snow, casting long shadows across the landscape. The world outside looks serene, almost magical in its stillness. But you know better. The wilderness is never as peaceful as it appears. It is a place of constant flux, of hidden dangers, and relentless challenges. But inside this cabin, you are safe for now. The fire, though low, continues to provide warmth, and the walls that shelter you hold firm against the cold and the world beyond. You take a moment to reflect on the task ahead today. Like every day in the wilderness, will be filled with work. The firewood once again needs to be replenished, and the traps must be checked. The cabin requires constant upkeep. Even the smallest imperfection, whether a loose log or a cracked wall, could make a life or death difference when the storms return. The mountain men who built this cabin knew this truth well. Their survival depended on the care they took with their shelter, the tools they made, and their understanding of the land around them. They were not just living, they were creating a life that would endure in the face of the wilderness's unyielding demands. For them, the cabin wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a symbol of their struggle and triumph. Every log that was notched and stacked, every crack sealed with moss or animal fur, every piece of firewood chopped was a testament to their perseverance. They were building more than a structure. They were building a life, carving out a space where they could thrive despite the harshness of their surroundings. The cabin they constructed wasn't just shelter, it was a manifestation of their will to endure and to adapt. The tasks that filled their days were endless. They had to be both craftsmen and survivalists, constantly adapting to the changing seasons and the unpredictable nature of the land. The men who lived here didn't just hunt and trap, they had to master every aspect of survival. They needed to know the land, its rhythms, and its challenges intimately. They learned to work with the land, using it to build their shelter, gather food, and keep themselves safe from predators. They understood the importance of foresight, preparing for the winter when the weather was still mild, gathering firewood, preserving food, and fortifying their homes against the snow. The isolation of the wilderness was perhaps the most difficult challenge they faced. It was not just the cold or the danger of predators, it was the loneliness. The men would go months without seeing another person. They were cut off from the world they had once known. In these moments of solitude, the cabin became more than just a shelter. It was a refuge, a place of solace in the midst of isolation. The mountain men knew how to fill their days with purpose, whether it was hunting, repairing the cabin, or recording their thoughts in journals. But even in their quiet moments, they understood the toll that solitude could take. As you sit by the fire, watching the embers glow, you feel a connection to those men, their lives unfolding in the very space you now inhabit. They endured what you are enduring now. The cold, the isolation, the constant work, and the quiet strength required to keep moving forward. They were part of a larger narrative, one of survival in an unforgiving land. Their cabins, built with care and sweat, are a testament to their resilience. And now, you too are living that story. Today, you will continue the work they began. The fire needs attention, the food stores need replenishing, and the cabin itself must be maintained. The cold will always be at your door. The wind will always howl against the walls. But inside, you have a safe space, a sanctuary from the world outside. The cabin stands strong, its logs solid, its foundation unwavering. It is a reminder that despite the world's unyielding challenges, you have created a place where survival is possible, where you can rest, eat, and sleep in relative peace. The mountain men who built this cabin didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences. They didn't have roads to travel or stores to visit. They had only what the land gave them, and in that harsh environment, they made something out of nothing. They carved out a life with their own hands, building homes that were as much about resilience as they were about function. Their cabins weren't just structures, they were symbols of their connection to the land, their understanding of the wilderness, and their ability to make the harsh world around them work for them. As you stand and prepare for the day's work, you realize that the legacy of these men is not just in the walls of this cabin, but in the way you live each day. Every log you chop, every trap you check, every gap you seal, is a small victory, a testament to your own resilience and determination. The wilderness may be cold and unforgiving, but you, like the mountain men who came before you, have found a way to make it your own. The challenges will continue, but with each passing day, you grow stronger, more connected to the land, and more deeply a part of this world. The storm has passed, but the work remains. As you step outside and feel the crisp air against your face, you understand that survival isn't just about enduring the harshness of the wilderness, it's about thriving in it. And with each task, each challenge, each small victory, you're becoming a part of the enduring spirit of the mountain men. The sun now sits low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape outside your cabin. The morning's work is behind you. Wood has been chopped, the fire rekindled, and the traps checked. Yet, the tasks never truly end. In the wilderness, there is always something that needs attention, some task that cannot be left unfinished. As you sit by the fire, taking a moment to rest, you can't help but think about the men who lived here before you. The mountain men whose hands built this very cabin. They, too, must have spent hours tending to the smallest details, ensuring that their lives would continue in this rugged place. It wasn't just the cold they battled, it was the ever-present feeling of being isolated from the rest of the world. The men who built this cabin spent long stretches without seeing anyone else. For most, it was a way of life. They didn't see the isolation as something to fear. They embraced it. They understood that in this world, where the land was untamed, they had to rely on themselves. The cabin was their safe haven, but it was also their fortress, their only refuge from the brutal elements outside. But the solitude wasn't always comforting. The mountain men lived in a world where survival wasn't just about strength, it was about patience and resourcefulness. The smallest mistake, the most minor oversight, could be the difference between life and death. They didn't have the luxury of convenience. The cabins they built were essential to their survival. They needed to be strong, airtight, and able to withstand the worst the wilderness had to offer. Each log that was placed, each stone set, had to be perfect. No gaps, no cracks. Not a single detail could be overlooked. And yet, as demanding as the physical labor was, the mental toll of isolation could be just as great. To be so far from civilization, so far from any kind of community, could wear down even the strongest man. But the mountain men knew that their survival depended on their ability to manage both their physical and mental well-being. They learned to find solace in the land itself. They found comfort in the solitude, in the quiet hours spent alone with only the fire and the sound of the wind for company. This isolation wasn't a weakness, it was a test of their resolve. You reflect on how much of that same spirit has taken root in you. The work, the isolation, the daily grind. It all feels like part of a larger story, one that connects you to those who lived here before. Just as they did, you've learned to adapt. The cabin you now occupy isn't just a shelter from the cold, It's a manifestation of survival itself. Every day, you find yourself learning more about the land, the weather, and the rhythms of life in the wilderness. You've begun to understand the cycles, the quiet before the storm, the calm after it passes, and the ways in which the land both challenges and nurtures you. The work that once felt endless is now familiar. The fire, the food, the cabin, each task is a part of a larger pattern, a rhythm that has become second nature. As you step outside to check the traps once more, you are greeted by the quiet of the snow-covered land. The crisp air bites at your face, and the snow crunches underfoot. There is something peaceful about this world, even with its dangers, even with the constant work. The wilderness, in all its harshness, has a quiet beauty to it. The wind whispers through the trees, the world untouched by the hustle and bustle of civilization. It is a world where survival is a way of life, a life that requires respect for the land, for the elements, and for the lessons learned by those who came before. You walk to the traps, your boots leaving deep impressions in the snow. The crunch of the cold beneath your feet is the only sound, and it becomes a familiar rhythm, one that seems to echo through the quiet world around you. As you check the traps, you notice how the wilderness, despite its challenges, offers its rewards. The animals that come from the land, the resources that are available, everything is interconnected. The mountain men understood this better than anyone. They knew that to live here, to truly thrive, they had to respect the land, work with it, and take only what they needed. The land doesn't give freely, but it offers opportunities to those who are willing to learn. The mountain men were masters of this, masters of adapting to their environment and using the land's resources wisely. They didn't fight nature, they learned to live with it. They understood that survival wasn't just about fighting the storm, it was about understanding when to wait, when to move, and when to act. They found a balance, a rhythm that allowed them to carve out a life in the wilderness. As you return to the cabin, you feel the weight of that same knowledge. The mountain men didn't just survive, they thrived. They built lives from the wilderness, from the very elements that most people would have turned away from. They built cabins, but they also built something deeper, a relationship with the land that allowed them to survive, to live on their own terms. The storm outside has passed, the wind now a soft murmur, but you know that the work continues. It always does. There is always something that needs to be done. But there is a quiet satisfaction in knowing that you have a place here, a cabin built with your own hands, just as it was for those who came before, and with each passing day, you are part of that same legacy. The cabin stands strong, its walls secure, the fire burning steady. The world outside may be harsh, but inside, there is warmth. And in this space, you are not just surviving, you are thriving. Like the mountain men who once called this place home, you've learned to adapt, to live in harmony with the wilderness, and to build a life that endures. As the evening light fades, the world outside the cabin takes on a peaceful, almost dreamlike quality. The sun's last rays reflect off the snow, casting the land in shades of pink and gold. The storm has passed, leaving a serene quiet in its wake. It is in moments like these, as the fire crackles softly and the night settles in, that you truly understand the legacy of those who came before you. The mountain men who built this cabin didn't just endure the wilderness, they lived it, breathed it, and made it their own. Their presence lingers here, in the logs, in the earth beneath your feet, and in the very air that surrounds you. The cabin, with its sturdy walls and warmth, is more than just shelter, it's a reflection of the men who crafted it, their ingenuity, and their resilience. Every log was placed with purpose, every nail driven with determination. These men understood that to survive in the wilderness, they had to build something that could withstand not only the elements, but also the isolation, the hunger, and the constant need for vigilance. This was not a life of convenience, it was a life of survival, where each day was a test of strength and skill. But beyond the physical challenges of survival, there was also the mental toll of isolation. The mountain men knew that their survival didn't just depend on their ability to hunt, trap, or build it, depended on their ability to maintain their sense of purpose in the face of solitude. They were often miles away from the nearest neighbor, cut off from the world they once knew. Yet, they found ways to fill the silence. They spent their days working the land, and when the work was done, they found solace in their journals, in the occasional letter from a distant friend, or in the very landscape that surrounded them. The solitude, though difficult, became a part of their lives, shaping them into men who were not only physically capable, but also mentally resilient. You can almost hear their quiet voices, the hum of their labor, the sound of tools being sharpened, logs being chopped, and fires being stoked. The mountain men's lives were filled with work, but it was the kind of work that brought a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't always glamorous or easy, but it was necessary. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for help or expecting things to come easily. Everything was earned. The food they ate, the warmth they felt, and the shelter they had were all products of their own effort. And yet, there was a profound satisfaction in that effort, a satisfaction that comes from knowing that you've carved out a place for yourself in the world. As you sit here now, by the warmth of the fire, you realize that you too have become part of this story. The work you do today, the tasks that fill your hours, are the same ones that kept the mountain men alive. The fire, the food, the cabin, they all depend on your attention, your care. The isolation is still present, but it no longer feels as daunting. The cabin is your refuge, a space that you've built from the same raw materials as those who lived here before. The fire burns steady, the wind howls outside, but within these walls, there is warmth, there is peace. Tomorrow, the work will continue. You will gather more firewood, check the traps, and make sure the cabin remains strong against whatever the wilderness throws your way. But for tonight, you rest. The storm has passed, and the quiet of the wilderness settles around you like a blanket. You are part of this land, just as those who came before you were. You have learned to live with the wilderness, not against it, and in doing so you have created something that endures. The mountain men understood the harshness of the wilderness, but they also understood its beauty. They saw the land not just as a challenge to overcome, but as a partner in their survival. They knew that the land could provide, but only if you learned to respect it, to work with it. And that respect, that understanding, is what allowed them to build homes, to survive winters, and to create a life that was entirely their own. As you sit by the fire, you are reminded of that spirit of survival. The wilderness is still wild, still unpredictable, but inside this cabin you are safe. The fire burns bright, and the world outside is still. For tonight, you are not just surviving, you are living. The legacy of the mountain men is alive in you, in the way you've learned to adapt, to endure, and to find peace in the solitude of the wilderness. Tomorrow, the work will continue, but for now, you rest, knowing that you are part of a story that has been told for generations. The night outside the cabin is still. The snow, though thick and deep, has settled in quiet drifts, leaving the world bathed in a soft, cold glow. The moon, faint but bright, casts long shadows across the land, turning every snow-covered branch into a silhouette. The wind has died down to a whisper, the howling of the past days replaced by the silence of the wilderness. In this moment, everything seems to be at peace. But within your cabin, there is a quiet energy, a readiness for whatever the next day may bring. You sit by the fire, the embers glowing red and warm, casting a flickering light on the walls of the cabin. The stillness of the night is a comfort, but it's also a reminder of the constant work that comes with living here. There is never truly a moment to rest for long. The mountain men who built this cabin knew this well. For them, every quiet moment was a brief respite before the next challenge. The cold never fully relented, the food never fully abundant, and the isolation never fully eased. Each day, They had to find strength in the tasks that awaited them, no matter how tiring, no matter how relentless. The cabin, though small, was a fortress against the wilderness. Every log, every piece of wood, was carefully chosen and placed with precision. The roof had to be strong enough to hold back the snow, the walls needed to be tight enough to keep the wind from slipping in, and the foundation had to be secure enough to hold the structure steady through the years. The men who built it didn't just construct a shelter, they created a life in the mountains. They knew that every crack, every crevice, every gap in the wall could invite the cold, and they made sure their cabin was sealed tight against the elements. You can't help but imagine the men who first lived in this place, their days filled with labor, their lives filled with a quiet determination. Each log they cut, each wall they built, each piece of firewood they stacked was done with the knowledge that survival required constant effort. There were no shortcuts. There was no one else to turn to for help. They had to rely on themselves, on their skill, and on the knowledge they had of the land. The wilderness was both a companion and an adversary. It offered resources, but it also demanded respect, and the mountain men who built this cabin understood that. The fire crackles and pops, sending a shower of embers into the air, but the warmth it provides is a comforting presence in the quiet cabin. The night outside is cold, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones, but inside, the hearth offers a respite. The mountain men would have felt the same way. This fire, this warmth, was their lifeline. It was what kept the frost at bay, what allowed them to cook, to dry their clothes, to stay alive. The fire wasn't just a source of heat, it was the pulse of their cabin, the thing that allowed them to survive. The storm may have passed, but the wilderness is never truly still. Tomorrow, more work will be waiting. The firewood needs to be replenished, the traps checked, the cabin maintained. And yet, there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, like the men before you have become part of the cycle of survival. Daily tasks, though never-ending, are what keep you anchored in this place. Each action, each decision is a small victory over the cold and the isolation. The wilderness may be harsh, but with every log chopped, every trap set, every meal prepared, you are asserting your place in it. The mountain men who first lived here were constantly adapting to the challenges around them. They learned how to use every resource at their disposal. They hunted, fished, trapped, and foraged, using the land's bounty wisely. They made their homes from the trees around them, and they knew how to survive when the land seemed to give nothing. They understood the rhythms of the wilderness, the seasons, the weather, the movement of animals, and they learned to work with those rhythms. It was a way of life, a way of being, that required both skill and patience. As you sit by the fire now, you feel a deep connection to them. Their legacy lives on in the very cabin you sit in the fire that burns steadily, in the tasks that await you tomorrow. The mountains, the cold, the isolation, they remain, as they always have. But now, you are part of the story. You too have learned to survive in this world, to make a life in a place that seems to offer nothing. But with each day, with each task, you carve out your place here, just as they did. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. The cold will return, the wind will howl again, and the work will continue. But for tonight, the fire is warm, and the cabin stands firm against the storm. The mountain men who lived here before you built their lives with their hands, and now you are carrying on that legacy. The fire crackles in the hearth, and the stillness of the night reminds you of the strength it takes to survive in the wilderness. You are part of that strength, part of that spirit, and as you rest by the fire, you know that you are not alone. The cabin is your refuge, your home, and as long as the fire burns, as long as the logs stand strong, you will continue to endure. Tomorrow, the work will resume, the cold will challenge you again. But for now, you rest, knowing that the mountain men who built this place before you would be proud. You are living their story. The fire is a steady, comforting presence in the cabin, crackling gently as the last of the day's light fades away. Outside, The world is wrapped in darkness, the quiet of the night stretching across the snow-covered landscape. The storm has passed, and the wilderness has settled into its familiar rhythm. But for you, in this cabin, there is a quiet stillness that brings a sense of peace, a peace that has been earned through the labor of the past days and weeks. The men who once lived here, who built these walls and carved out a life from the rugged land, would have known this same feeling, the calm that follows a day's work, the knowledge that you've done what needed to be done, and that you've made it through another day in this vast, untamed world. As you sit by the fire, the weight of the day settles into your bones. The wood is stacked, the traps have been checked, and the cabin is secure. The familiar tasks are done, and now you are left with the quiet of the evening to reflect. The mountain men who built this cabin lived their lives much like this, steadily, quietly, always working toward the next task, the next challenge. There was no end to the work, but in each task they found purpose. They didn't seek comfort or luxury. They sought survival, and they built their homes with the understanding that every part of their shelter had to contribute to that goal. The isolation they faced wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. To be so far removed from civilization, to live in such a remote place, meant that they had to rely on themselves for everything. There were no neighbors to rely on, no community to share burdens with. They were alone with the land, and they had to learn to find strength in that solitude. The cabin, though small and humble, was a place of refuge, a space that offered both safety and peace, even amidst the harshness of the surrounding wilderness. You can almost hear their footsteps echo in the cabin, the sounds of men working, living, and surviving in the same space you now occupy. The wind outside might howl, the cold might press against the walls, but inside, they found warmth not just in the fire, but in the work itself. Each log split, each meal prepared, each piece of the cabin maintained, it all played a part in their survival. They didn't just survive the land, they lived with it, used it, and found ways to thrive in its embrace. And so, as you sit here now, wrapped in the warmth of the fire, you can feel the weight of their legacy. The fire burns low, but it still provides a steady glow, a reminder of the effort that goes into survival. The wilderness hasn't softened, and the work is never truly done. But you, too, have learned what they knew, that survival is about more than just existing. It's about making a life, building something that lasts, and finding a sense of peace even in the quiet solitude of the wilderness. The tasks for tomorrow are already forming in your mind. The firewood will need to be replenished, the traps will need to be checked again, and the cabin will need constant care. But for tonight, you rest. The work is done, the fire is steady, and the cabin stands firm against the cold. Outside, the wilderness waits, as it always does, but inside, you are sheltered. The mountain men who built this cabin didn't have the luxury of resting for long, but they knew that the moments of peace were just as important as the moments of work. They were part of the cycle of survival, just as you are now. Tomorrow, the storms may return, and the cold will once again test the strength of your cabin. But tonight, as the fire flickers and the wind whispers outside, you are part of something larger, something timeless. You are living in the footsteps of those who carved out a life here, who made their mark on the land, and who endured against all odds. And with each day, you add your own mark to that legacy. The fire continues to burn softly, the embers glowing in the hearth, and as you settle into the quiet of the cabin, you feel the peace that only comes from knowing you have done your part. Tomorrow, the work will begin again, but tonight, you rest in the knowledge that you have created a life here, just as the mountain men before you did. You've made your place in the wilderness, and you've learned how to survive, not just endure. The cabin is your home, your sanctuary, and in the stillness of the night, it feels like more than just wood and stone. It feels like a living thing, built from the labor and spirit of those who came before, and now, from your own hands. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tasks, and new triumphs, But for tonight, you are safe. The fire burns steady, the world outside is still, and you rest, knowing that you are part of the enduring legacy of the mountain men who built this cabin, who lived in this wilderness, and who showed that survival isn't just about enduring, it's about thriving in the face of the wild. The silence of the night is unbroken, save for the soft crackling of the fire. The wind, though still, has left its mark, howling through the trees earlier, but now there is only the soft, steady peace of the wilderness. The moonlight spills across the snow, casting a cool, silvery glow over the world outside, and the stars above seem closer tonight, more vivid, as though they too are taking a breath after the storm has passed. The air is sharp, crisp, and clear, but inside the cabin you are sheltered, wrapped in warmth both from the fire and the work of those who came before. The cabin stands as a quiet testament to the mountain men who built it, their hands, their labor, their sweat. Each log that forms the walls, each beam that holds the roof, each notch carved with care tells a story of survival, of adaptation, of finding a way to thrive in a land that gave so little. The work was never easy. It was unrelenting, just as the land was, but it was in the constant labor that they found their purpose, their rhythm. There was no room for complacency. Every day was a fight against the elements, a battle to maintain what they had built, to ensure that their shelter, their fire, their food would last. And now, as you sit by the fire, you realize that the same rhythm has settled into your bones. The work that once felt like an endless list of tasks is now second nature. The chopping of wood, the tending to the fire, the checking of traps, these actions, simple in their own right, have become the heartbeat of your existence. They are no longer burdens, but rituals. Each task you perform is not just for survival, it's a part of something larger, something that connects you to those who came before. The men who built this cabin knew the value of every small action, for in the wilderness, nothing could be taken for granted. The solitude, which once felt so daunting, now feels like a space in which to breathe. The days are long and filled with work, but the quiet moments, the ones spent by the fire with only the sound of crackling wood and the occasional gust of wind outside, are the moments of peace. These are the times when the mountain men found their strength. They lived not only with the land, but with themselves. Alone in the wilderness, surrounded by the wild, they learned to accept the solitude, to find solace in it. The isolation was a challenge, but it also brought clarity, a chance to reflect, to connect with something deeper, something more enduring than the hardships of daily survival. You are a part of that tradition now. The mountain men knew that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about mental fortitude, about pushing through the isolation, the cold, the never-ending work, and finding something meaningful in the effort. It's a lesson that rings true for you now. The work of survival is endless, but with each passing day, you grow stronger in body and mind. You've learned to trust yourself, to rely on the land, and to respect the solitude that comes with this place. Outside, the snow continues to blanket the world, the land hidden beneath a soft, white veil. The wilderness remains as it always has been, untamed, vast, and indifferent. Yet, within these walls, you have created a small, enduring haven. The cabin is a fortress, but it is more than that. It is a reflection of the resilience of those who built it, and a testament to your own strength. You are not just surviving in this land, you are living in it, carving out your own space in the wilderness. And like the men who came before, you are learning to thrive here, in the quiet, in the solitude, and in the work that fills each day. Tomorrow, there will be more work. The wind will pick up again, the cold will press against the walls, and the cycle of survival will continue. But for tonight, you are at peace. The fire burns steadily, the warmth radiates through the cabin, and you sit in the comfort of your own labor. You've earned this moment of rest. The mountain men who lived here before you worked tirelessly, but they also understood the value of quiet moments like these, the moments where they could reflect on their efforts, where they could rest and find solace in the stillness of the wilderness. And so, as you sit by the fire, the soft glow of the embers reflecting in your eyes, you are reminded of the legacy you are now a part of. The wilderness may challenge you, but it has also shaped you. The cabin, built by those before you, has become your home, your refuge, and a symbol of endurance, strength, and resilience. The work will never stop, but for now, there is peace. The fire crackles, the wind whispers through the trees, and you are safe within these walls, a part of the unbroken chain of survival that stretches back through the generations. The first light of dawn filters through the small window in the cabin, casting long beams of pale sunlight across the room. The fire, though dim, still holds some of its warmth, a reminder that the night has passed and the day has begun. The world outside is quiet, the snow undisturbed, save for the marks of your own footsteps from the previous day. The storm has passed, but the wilderness is never truly still. The cold is already creeping back into the air, and the land waits, ready for the day's work to begin again. The mountain men who lived here before you knew this rhythm well, the quiet that followed the storm, the stillness that would always be broken by the demands of survival. You stand, stretching, and take a moment to feel the cool air against your skin. The cabin feels warm in contrast, the hearth a steady presence that has kept the cold at bay. The fire is already beginning to fade, but the embers still glow faintly, a reminder of the night's warmth. The mountain men who built this cabin knew the importance of the fire. It was more than a source of warmth, it was their lifeline. Without it, the cold would overtake them, and without that constant heat, their chances of survival would diminish drastically. But survival in this wilderness required more than fire. It required knowledge, skill, and constant vigilance. The men who built this cabin had to be resourceful, always preparing for what the next season would bring. They had no stores of food to fall back on, no markets to visit when the harvest was poor. They relied on the land, its animals, its plants, its rivers for their survival. They knew how to hunt, how to trap, how to preserve food, and how to make use of everything the land provided. Every day was spent working, whether it was gathering firewood, checking the traps, mending the cabin, or preparing food. And each day, as the tasks were completed, they found satisfaction in knowing they were one step closer to enduring another day in the wilderness. As you prepare for the day ahead, you feel that same sense of connection to those men. The work is never ending, but it is part of what keeps you grounded here. The tasks may seem small, chopping firewood, checking traps, repairing the cabin, but they are the foundation of survival. The mountain men didn't have the luxury of convenience. They didn't have a community to rely on, no one to help them when they needed it most. They built their homes with their own hands and kept them standing with the same effort. They created a life in the wilderness, and through their hard work, they carved out a place where survival was not just possible, but achievable. The air is cold when you step outside, the breath catching in your throat as it hits your lungs. The landscape, though stunning in its stillness, is harsh. The snow, deep and undisturbed, stretches for miles, the trees standing silent like sentinels in the distance. The world is waiting, but it is a waiting that will require effort. There are traps to check, firewood to gather, and repairs to make. But there is also a beauty to the landscape, a raw, untouched quality that speaks to the solitude and the freedom of this life. The mountain men who once lived here saw this beauty, but they also understood the danger it held. The wilderness could be unforgiving, but with every day of work, they forged a connection with the land, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, and using it to survive. As you make your way to the traps, the crisp sound of snow underfoot is the only sound that breaks the silence. Each step, though simple, feels significant, as though you are becoming a part of the land, as though each footfall is a mark of your presence in a place where few dared to live. The traps, carefully set, stand as reminders of the mountain men's ability to adapt. They relied on these traps to catch smaller game when larger animals were scarce. The land may have been harsh, But the men learned how to work with it, how to use its resources to feed and sustain them. The work of checking the traps is as familiar as the morning routine. The cold, the silence, the steady rhythm of the task, it all feels like a continuation of something that's always been. The mountain men who lived here were never really alone. They were part of a community, bound by the land and the tasks they shared. The traps, like the cabin, were a part of the way they lived. They weren't just about catching food, they were about creating a life that depended on the land, the seasons, and the ability to adapt. After the traps are checked and the firewood gathered, you return to the cabin, feeling the weight of the day's work, but also the quiet satisfaction that comes with it. The cabin is secure, the fire is burning, and the land has once again offered its bounty. The work is never truly done, but you are ready for whatever comes next. The legacy of the mountain men lives on in this cabin, in the tasks that fill your day, and in the way you've learned to live with the wilderness. They understood the importance of each moment, of each task, of each piece of the puzzle that made up survival. And now, you understand it too. The wilderness is vast, and the work is unceasing. But for tonight, the cabin is warm, the fire is steady, and you are safe. The storm may return, the cold may press against the walls, but you are part of the land now, part of the legacy of those who lived and thrived here before you. And tomorrow, you will continue the work, just as they did. You will continue to survive, to adapt, and to thrive. The fire has burned low now, the flickering orange glow casting long shadows on the cabin walls. The storm outside, though it lingers in the air, no longer seems as fierce. The snow still piles up in thick drifts around the cabin, a reminder that the wilderness is always present, ever-changing, and untamed. But inside, you find a sense of quiet peace. The constant work of the past days has settled into your bones, and the rhythm of the wilderness has become familiar, like the sound of the wind through the trees. You can't help but think about the men who built this cabin, the mountain men who once lived here in solitude, carving out a life in this vast, unforgiving land. They too must have known the peace that comes after a day's work, when the fire crackles in the hearth and the storm howls outside. But within these walls, there is warmth, safety, and a sense of accomplishment. The life they lived was one of constant effort, never-ending challenges, and yet they found something profound in it, a connection to the land and to the very act of survival. The cabin itself is a reflection of their resilience. Every piece of wood, every stone, every corner that has been carefully crafted speaks of their ingenuity and determination. The walls are strong, the roof solid, and the hearth, though now dim, has always been a symbol of their fight against the cold. It wasn't just about building a shelter, it was about building a place that could stand the test of time, a place where they could endure. And they did. They endured not just because of their physical strength, but because of their mental fortitude, their ability to adapt to the constant demands of the wilderness. As you sit by the fire, you reflect on how much of their spirit has become part of you. The work that once seemed endless, the chopping of firewood, the checking of traps, the care of the cabin is now second nature. It has become a part of the rhythm of your life. The solitude that once felt oppressive now feels like a space in which to breathe, to reflect, to find clarity. The wilderness, with all its beauty and danger, has become your teacher, and you, like the mountain men before you, have learned its lessons. The work is never truly done. There is always firewood to gather, the cabin to maintain, the traps to check. The land is constantly shifting, and you must remain vigilant. But there is peace in knowing that you are ready. The lessons learned by those who came before you are now yours, etched into every task you perform, every decision you make. The mountain men didn't just survive, they thrived, because they understood the land, respected its power, and adapted to its ever-changing nature. You too have come to understand these things. You've learned how to make the wilderness work for you, how to survive not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Tomorrow, the work will continue, The cold will press against the cabin, the wind will howl, and the tasks of survival will remain. But tonight, you rest. The cabin is secure, the fire burns steady, and you are safe. The storm outside is but a distant memory, and in this moment, you are not just surviving, you are living. The mountain men who built this cabin didn't have much, but they had everything they needed to endure: resilience, resourcefulness, and a deep connection to the land. And now, you too have those things. You are part of that legacy, carrying on the traditions of those who came before you. As the fire crackles and the night deepens, you feel a quiet satisfaction settle over you. You have done your part. You've worked the land, maintained your cabin, and kept the fire burning. The wilderness may challenge you, but it will never break you. Tomorrow, you will rise, just as the mountain men did, and face the new day with strength and determination. But for now, the cabin is warm, the storm is over, and you are at peace. The wind may pick up again, the cold may press in, but tonight, you are safe. And tomorrow, you will continue the work that has been passed down through generations, the work of survival, of resilience, and of thriving in the face of the wilderness. The legacy of the mountain men lives on in you, and with each passing day it becomes more and more a part of who you are. The wind, once fierce and unrelenting, has quieted to a soft, almost imperceptible murmur as you wake the next morning. The world outside your cabin is a breathtaking sight. Crystal clear skies stretch endlessly above, the sun casting long, gentle shadows over the snowy landscape. The storm has passed, leaving behind a pristine layer of snow that sparkles in the early light. The wilderness, which was once harsh and unforgiving, now appears serene and still, offering a brief respite before the next challenge arises. The tasks of the day lie ahead, as they always do. But as you move through your morning routine, stoking the fire, gathering your tools, preparing for the day's work, you can't help but reflect on how far you've come. The cabin, once a new, unfamiliar place, now feels like an extension of yourself. Each log, each beam, every corner and crevice is familiar, as though it has become a part of you. The solitude, once overwhelming, has transformed into a quiet companion, and the constant rhythm of survival, the chopping of wood, the setting of traps, the tending of the fire, has become second nature. It wasn't always this way. The first days in this wilderness, when you first arrived, must have felt like a constant battle. The wind, the cold, the isolation, everything was a challenge. But with each passing day, you learned. You learned the language of the land, the way the wind shifts before a storm, the way animals move when they know winter is coming. You learned to respect the wilderness, to listen to it, and in turn, it taught you how to survive. You've become part of this land, just as the mountain men who built this cabin did. The fire crackles gently as you stoke it, the warmth pushing back against the chill of the morning. It is a simple task, but it is the heart of your existence here. Without the fire, the cabin would be nothing more than a shelter from the wind, and you would be nothing more than cold and vulnerable. The mountain men who lived here before you knew this truth well. They didn't just build a shelter, they built a life, and the fire was central to that life. It was the hearth around which everything revolved, the warmth it provided, the light it gave, the meals it cooked. It was the symbol of their ability to endure in a world that gave little and demanded much. As you gather firewood from the pile stacked near the cabin, you pause for a moment to take in the silence of the land. The snow stretches out before you, untouched, like a vast blank canvas. The cold is sharp, biting at your skin, but it is a familiar cold. It is the cold that the mountain men knew well. They felt it in their bones, the way the air changes with each passing season. They had to live with it, adapt to it, or be overwhelmed by it. And they did, in their own quiet way. They made homes from the trees and the land, relying on their wits, their skill, and their sheer determination to survive. Every day in the wilderness is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. The mountain men knew that survival wasn't just about enduring the hardships, it was about adapting, learning, and becoming part of the land itself. They built homes, yes, but more than that, they built relationships with the wilderness. They worked with the land, not against it. They found ways to make the most of what was given to them, and in doing so, they learned to live not just with the land, but because of it. Now, as you make your way back to the cabin, firewood in hand, you feel that same connection to the land. You've learnt its rhythms. You've become part of its quiet pulse. The cabin is your home, and just like the mountain men before you, you've carved a place for yourself in a world that is wild and untamed. But it's not just about survival. It's about living, finding moments of peace, of quiet satisfaction, even in the midst of the hard work that fills each day. The sun is climbing higher now, and the world around you seems to breathe, coming alive again after the storm. The wilderness, while harsh, is full of beauty. The trees, weighed down by snow, glisten in the light. The air is crisp and fresh, and the world feels open, vast, and full of possibility. The mountain men who built this cabin didn't just survive. They lived with the land, respected it, and became a part of it. Their cabins, like yours, are symbols of endurance, of the quiet strength that it takes to live in a place that demands so much. As you sit by the fire later, your work done for the day, you understand that the legacy of the mountain men is not just in the cabin or the tasks they performed. It's in the way they adapted to the world around them, finding strength not just in the physical work but in their ability to understand the land, to move with its rhythms, and to live alongside it. You too are living in that legacy, learning to survive, to adapt, and to thrive in the wilderness. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. The work never ends. But for tonight, the fire burns steady, the cabin is warm, and the land outside is quiet. The wilderness remains unchanged, but you have changed. You have become part of it, just as those who came before you did. You found a home here, and in the quiet peace that comes with a day's work, you know that you are, at last, truly a part of this land. The fire has begun to dim, the last of its embers glowing softly in the hearth as the night settles in. The storm has passed, leaving behind a world of stillness, untouched by human hands. The snow outside sparkles faintly under the pale light of the moon, the wilderness now quiet, serene, and full of a kind of peaceful resolve. The air is still cold, crisp, but the cabin is warm, and here, inside these walls, you are once again reminded of the labor that has gone into making this place your home. As the last light from the fire fades, you pull your blanket tighter around you, the warmth of it cocooning you against the evening chill. Outside, the world is wild, cold, and beautiful in its quiet isolation. Inside, there is a different kind of beauty, a beauty born of the effort, the determination, and the resilience of those who came before you. The mountain men who lived here were men of action, always working, always moving forward, always adapting to the demands of the land. They didn't just survive, they lived with purpose. And now, you too have learned to live with purpose, moving through the days with the same quiet strength that those men once possessed. You think of the cabin again, of the work it took to build it and maintain it, the logs, the stones, the roof that kept the snow out, the fire that kept the cold at bay. It wasn't just about survival. It was about creating a space to thrive, even in a place that gave so little in return. Every log stacked, every beam placed, every crevice sealed was a symbol of the mountain men's commitment to their survival. And now that same commitment is yours. The work is never truly finished, but it's that work, the chopping, the gathering, the tending, that makes this cabin a home. The men who lived here before you knew that the land would never give anything for free. It required constant effort, constant attention. The wilderness could not be tamed, it could only be worked with, understood, respected. They learned how to live in harmony with the land, not as masters of it, but as partners. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but it was a life they carved out with their own hands. Their legacy lives on not just in the walls of this cabin, but in the way you live each day. The fire you stoke, the wood you chop, the cabin you maintain, all of these are part of the ongoing legacy of survival and resilience. Tonight, as the wind whispers through the trees and the fire slowly burns out, you feel connected to the men who built this place. You share their determination, their resilience, and their quiet resolve. The isolation that once felt overwhelming now feels like a space to breathe, a space to reflect. It's a place to find peace in the midst of the work, a space to rest when the day's labor is done. It's easy to forget how much effort goes into creating this peace, how much work, how many hours spent building, maintaining, adapting, but tonight, as you sit by the fading fire, you remember. You've come a long way since you first arrived. The land was a stranger, its cold, its isolation, its demands all unfamiliar, but now, you know it. You understand its rhythms, its patterns, its challenges. The wilderness is still wild, still unforgiving, but you are no longer a stranger to it. You've learned how to survive in it, how to live with it, how to make it your own. And, just like the mountain men before you, you've learned that survival isn't just about enduring, it's about finding meaning in the work, finding purpose in each task, and learning to live in harmony with the land. Tomorrow, the work will continue. There will be more wood to chop, more fire to stoke, more tasks to complete. The wilderness will continue to test you, continue to challenge you, but you know that you are ready. You've learned the lessons that the land offers, just as those before you did. And with each passing day, you grow stronger in body and spirit. But tonight, as the fire flickers one last time, you rest. The storm has passed, the night is still, and the wilderness outside is as vast and silent as ever. Inside, you are warm, you are safe, and you are at peace. The cabin stands strong, its walls a quiet testament to the labor, the love, and the spirit that built it. Tomorrow will bring more challenges, but tonight you have earned this moment. You have earned the rest, the quiet, and the peace that comes with knowing you've survived another day. The world outside may be wild and untamed, but in this cabin, you've found a space to breathe, to reflect, and to thrive. And as the last of the fire burns out, you close your eyes, knowing that the legacy of the mountain men lives on in you. Tomorrow, you will rise again, ready for whatever the wilderness has in store. The stillness of the night has deepened, the cabin now resting in a quiet lull that mirrors the vastness of the wilderness beyond. The fire is no more than a glowing remnant of what it once was, the embers now soft and warm, holding on to the last flicker of the day's life. Outside, the snow-covered land lies undisturbed, the moonlight casting long shadows on the earth, a landscape unchanged, as if frozen in time. There is something peaceful in that stillness, something profound in knowing that the land remains constant, that it holds a history older than any man who has walked its surface. Inside your cabin, the wind can be heard faintly as it dances through the cracks, but it no longer feels as fierce as it did earlier. The storm, with all its force and fury, has moved on, leaving behind only the remnants of its presence. The snowdrifts that have piled up against the cabin are like the quiet remnants of a battle won. You are safe now, within these walls, surrounded by the things that keep you warm and alive. The fire may have died down, but its warmth still lingers, a reminder of the energy that went into keeping it alive. You think about the mountain men again. They lived through the same storms, the same isolation, the same relentless rhythm of survival that you now know so well. They too knew what it was like to feel the wind howl outside, to hear the quiet settle after a storm, and to find comfort in the warmth of a fire that was stoked with care and attention. The legacy of those men is not just in the cabin they built, but in the lives they lived, the quiet, unspoken resilience that saw them through the hardships of the wilderness. As you lay down, pulling your blanket tighter around you, you find a moment of peace. The work has been done for the day, and tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tasks, and new opportunities. But for tonight, you rest. The cabin is warm, the land outside is silent, and the fire has given way to a quiet calm. The world outside might seem vast and overwhelming, but inside these walls you are safe. This, after all, is what survival is about. It's not just about enduring the cold, the storms, or the loneliness. It's about creating a life in the face of it all. The mountain men who built this cabin had no illusions about the wilderness. They knew it was a place of constant change, where one could never truly relax, never let their guard down. And yet, they built homes, they built lives, and they found ways to thrive. They used the land as a tool, shaped it to their needs, and made it their own. And in that, there was beauty. In the very struggle to survive, there was the creation of something lasting, something that could endure long after the men themselves were gone. You feel connected to them now, not in a way that's grand or romantic, but in the quiet, everyday actions that make up life. The work that fills your days, the rhythm of survival, the slow, steady march of time in this wilderness, it's all part of that same legacy. The mountain men didn't have much, but they made the most of what they had. They understood that survival required both physical labor and mental strength. They knew that to live in the wilderness was to constantly adapt, to constantly find a way forward, no matter how difficult the day might seem. And now, you are part of that cycle. The wind may rise again, the snow may fall harder, and the cold may come back with a vengeance, but you, like the men before you, will continue. You will gather wood, stoke the fire, check the traps, and maintain the cabin. The rhythm of survival will continue, and with each passing day, you will become more deeply woven into the fabric of this land. You'll learn its moods, its challenges, and its rewards, and in doing so, you'll make a life here. The wilderness will always be wild, but it will no longer be a stranger to you. Tomorrow, the work will begin again. The land will demand more of you, the cold will return, and the tasks will never truly stop. But tonight, you are warm. The fire may have burned down, but the warmth it gave you still lingers in the room. The mountain men who built this cabin would have known this moment, the quiet peace that comes after the work of the day is done. The wilderness will never be fully tamed, but it can be lived with, respected, and understood. And as you drift off to sleep, you know that you have done your part in this great, ongoing cycle of survival. The storm has passed, the night is still, and you, like the men who came before you, are part of the land, part of the cabin, and part of the unbroken thread of resilience that runs through this wilderness. The quiet of the night deepens as you awaken to the soft glow of early morning light spilling through the cabin's small window. The wind outside has returned to a gentle whisper, and the snow-covered world appears untouched, as if the land itself is holding its breath. The fire, though nearly out, still offers some warmth, its embers glowing faintly in the hearth. The cabin feels cozy, safe an anchor in the otherwise wild, untamed landscape. As you stretch, feeling the remnants of the night's rest settle into your bones, you pause to listen. The wilderness outside is both tranquil and vast, its silence only broken by the occasional shift of snow on the roof or the soft creak of the cabin. The peace feels hard-earned, a product of the steady rhythm of life that you've come to know over these past days. Every log you've chopped, every trap you've set, and every meal you've prepared is now a part of the fabric of your existence here. The mountain men who lived in this cabin knew the value of this quiet. They knew that amid the challenges of the wilderness, there would be moments like this, moments of peace earned through hard work, resilience, and an understanding of the land. You move slowly, deliberately, feeling the cool air of the cabin against your skin. The first task of the day awaits. The fire must be stoked, the traps checked, and more firewood gathered. The cabin, though warm, requires constant attention. The elements do not relent. The wind continues to press against the walls, and the cold seeks every opportunity to creep inside. But you are prepared. The tasks are familiar, a part of your daily rhythm. Like the men before you, you've come to understand that the work is not just a means to an end, it's a vital part of this life, a constant reminder that survival requires effort and care. The fire is quickly rekindled, and its warmth begins to spread through the cabin. You gather your tools and head outside, the cold immediately biting at your skin. But the sensation is not unfamiliar. The cold is part of the land, and though it is harsh, it is also beautiful in its quiet, crystalline clarity. The snow crunches beneath your boots as you make your way toward the traps, and the world around you is still silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. There is something peaceful about this, about moving through the land with purpose, knowing that each step brings you closer to maintaining the life you've built here. As you check the traps, you find them empty once more. But this too is part of the rhythm. The wilderness does not yield its bounty easily. It requires patience, persistence, and a deep understanding of its cycles. The mountain men who lived here before you understood this. They knew that not every trap would catch its prey, not every hunt would be successful, but they also knew that each failure was just a step toward the next success. They worked with the land, respected its rhythms, and adapted when things didn't go as planned. In this, they found strength. You continue to check the traps, moving methodically, your breath steaming in the cold air. The world feels large, expansive, and yet there is a sense of intimacy in it. The land is vast, but as you move through it, it becomes familiar. Each tree, each patch of snow, each drift of wind becomes a part of your world. The mountain men knew this feeling well. They lived in the land, learned its secrets, and in doing so became a part of it. They understood that the wilderness would always be wild, always unpredictable, but that survival in it wasn't about control, it was about living alongside it. As you gather firewood and make your way back to the cabin, you feel the weight of the day's work settling in. The fire will burn steady again, the cabin will remain warm, and the wilderness will continue to challenge you. But you have learned, as the men before you did, that survival isn't just about fighting the land, it's about adapting to it, living with it, and understanding that each day is both a victory and a learning experience. You've learned to respect the land, and in return, it has taught you how to survive in it. Back inside, the warmth of the fire wraps around you, and you pause for a moment, taking it all in. The work, the cold, the rhythm of life in the wilderness, it's all part of the story that the mountain men began. The cabin they built, the fire they tended, the land they worked with, it all lives on in you now. Tomorrow, the work will continue. The tasks will be the same. But each day, you grow more deeply connected to this place, more fully immersed in the rhythms of survival. The wilderness is vast, but you have found your place within it. Like the mountain men, you are part of the land, part of its ongoing story of resilience, of adaptation, and of survival. The stillness of the cabin is almost overwhelming in its quiet. The fire now burns steadily, its warmth wrapping the room in a soft embrace. The tasks of the day are done. Firewood has been gathered, the traps checked, the cabin maintained. Outside, the landscape remains pristine, untouched by the rush of human activity. The snow blankets the world in a soft white silence, and the wilderness once again reveals its timeless beauty. The moonlight catches the snowflakes, scattering them across the landscape like glitter, a soft, ethereal glow over the world. It is in moments like this, when the day's work has been completed and the world outside is peaceful, that you feel truly connected to this land. You sit by the fire, the warmth now soaking deep into your bones, and you let the quiet of the night fill you. The mountain men who lived here before you would have felt this same peace, the peace that comes from knowing that the work of survival is constant, that the challenges are never truly over, but that in each completed task there is satisfaction, there is relief. The knowledge that, no matter how difficult the wilderness may be, you have the strength to face it. You have the fire to warm you, the cabin to shelter you, and the land to sustain you. But it wasn't always this way. The first days, the first months, must have been filled with uncertainty and struggle. The wilderness was unfamiliar, unforgiving. The cold must have been sharper, the isolation more profound. Yet, the mountain men didn't turn away from the challenge. They faced it head on, day after day. They built their homes not just for protection from the elements, but as symbols of their determination, their resilience. Every log stacked, every stone laid, was a testament to their unwavering spirit. They knew that survival wasn't about escaping the wilderness. It was about becoming a part of it, adapting to it, living alongside it. You are living that same truth now.